Aries, Guardians of Hades romance series. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Kevin Foley. Chapter 20. Aries slid the door to the balcony open and stepped out onto the tiles. He thought about moving behind Megan and holding her just as he had wanted to during his meeting with his brothers, but moved to stand beside her instead. She didn't look up at him. Her gaze remained dead ahead, locked on the misty park. It was raining again, light drizzle that stole the far end of the park and the tall buildings there from view. They didn't mean to shout at you. He leaned his forearms on the railing and sighed. How many times had he stood here on a rainy day, hating how the droplets fizzed and evaporated before touching him? It was still strange to be without his power. Would it feel weird when he got it back? He looked across at Megan, studying her profile. Would she leave him? He didn't want to contemplate the answer to that question, so he firmly pushed it out of his mind and focused on her and the present. The whole damn thing with demons. It's complicated, he said, and her gaze finally left the city and came to rest on him. Her rich brown eyes held his, and she remained mute, waiting. He wasn't sure where to start. Karis was right, and she needed to know, but it was hard to explain some things about this world and what had happened there, especially to someone who was still becoming accustomed to being part of that world. He turned his back on the city and leaned at an angle with his elbows on the railing. He tipped his head back and stared up at the sky. Water spotted his face, fine and light, a refreshing mist. He brought his head down again and ran his fingers over his damp hair, combing it from his face. Megan had moved closer, standing only a few inches from him now. Her expression had softened, too, turning expectant and curious. He wanted to kiss her when she looked like that. Centuries before I was born, there was an uprising by corrupted souls of the dead in the underworld. My father went to war with them with the aid of some of the other gods who reside in his realm. He edged closer to her, until his leg brushed hers. The small contact between them was enough to assuage his hunger to touch her. He wanted to forget talking about history and explaining things, and skip straight to the kissing and the making love. He wanted to finish what they had started back in her apartment, and should anything interrupt this time, he was going to ignore it. The world could end, and he wouldn't care. He just wanted to make love with her. The souls caused widespread destruction, killing anyone in their path, even each other sometimes. What happened to them? My father defeated them, but not before they had killed thousands. The underworld is a place where all souls go, the good and the bad. There are different areas for each, but the dead all go there to live on eternally. He closed his eyes and tried to picture his home and the different realms. His memory of the world he loved was growing foggy now, centuries of time passed in the mortal world distorting it. He opened his eyes and looked into Megan's. The corrupted souls killed others from all the different realms, good and bad. "Can you kill a soul?" she said with a small frown, and he nodded. "What happens when a soul dies?" Endless darkness. It ceases to exist in the underworld and passes on to another place, a darker place. "That's terrible." "It is. The acts of the corrupted souls enraged my father, who cares for all in his realm equally. He banished the demons, as we came to call them, from the underworld, and forbade them to ever enter it again." "But the demons born in this world aren't the same demons who originally attacked everyone in the underworld." He knew where she was going with this one. "No, but my father's orders still stand. The demons are still dangerous, even more so now that they have form. Time passed, and the demons grew in number in the mortal world, and spread their black blood to the mortals, breeding with them and bringing about a new species of demon. They gained human appearances, made of flesh and bone, able to hide amongst the mortals. Father considered them living creatures after that, and all living creatures need his permission to enter the underworld.
All because of a war?
Not a war. 2 wars. He lifted his left hand, reached out to her, and smoothed his palm across her pale cheek. She needed more rest. There were dark crescents under her beautiful eyes. When Karis was born, my father was distracted. 3 days after his birth, the demons launched an attack, severely injuring Cerberus, my father's beloved protector, and killing thousands of hellspawn soldiers. Blood ran in rivers across the underworld. The demons reached the gates of the palace where my mother and Karis were, and father was so enraged that he destroyed them all. Thanatos and Hypnos fought at his side again, but neither were able to match him.
That's terrible. Were your mother and Karis all right?
Her eyes searched his, and he smiled at her, thanking her for being so concerned about his family. Father would never allow anything to happen to them, but it had been close. He created the first gate, and vowed that from then on, only the key of Hades would be able to grant someone passage between the mortal world and the underworld.
And you're the keys.
She frowned and glanced back out at the rain.
I didn't realize the demons had caused so much bloodshed and violence. I never would have said what I did if I had.
I know. My brothers know. You have to understand, sweetheart. If the demons can open a gate, they will seek to keep it open. An oracle foresaw that a demon uprising would happen again, and they would breach the gates we protect, destroying them so they remained always open.
She shivered. But if they did that,
all of the dead souls in the underworld would be free to come and go. This world would merge with the underworld. Both would be destroyed, and a new world built in their place. He despised that thought, and that hatred had kept him going for 2 centuries, burning in his heart, fueling his fight. He looked over his shoulder at the city, catching a flicker of the other world, flaming red and filled with the death cries of millions.
You really need to get that amulet back, and your power, too.
She forced a smile that he saw right through. This was the reason he hadn't wanted to tell her everything about the demons and the gates. He hadn't wanted to scare her, not when he had no intention of letting what the oracles had seen come to pass. He wrapped his arms around her, drawing her close to him, so her front pressed against his. She settled her hands against his chest, and then pressed her cheek to it, fitting perfectly in his embrace. "I'll get my power and the amulet back. Don't worry about that," he whispered, and lowered his head and pressed his lips to her dark hair. He breathed her in, her scent of evening sunshine and jasmine warming him and chasing away the chill in the damp air, and held her closer, needing to feel her against him, needing to touch her as he thought about what would come after he regained his power. "Whatever happens then, nothing will change how I feel about you, Megan." She drew back and looked up at him, her beautiful brown eyes soft with affection, and a smile curving the corners of her lips.
"Nothing will change how I feel about you either, Ares."
Music to his ears. He dipped his head and captured her lips in a soft kiss, trying to keep it gentle, like the ones she had given to him before. The feather-light caress of her lips teased him and stirred his emotions, warming him inside and making him feel a little giddy. Not that he would ever admit that aloud. She leaned into the kiss, pressing him back into the balcony railing, her body against his. Delicious. He slid his arms downwards, palms following the graceful curve of her back, and settled his hands over her bottom. She moaned when he squeezed, her tongue coming out to play along the seam of his lips. He opened to her and tasted her, deepening the kiss and losing himself in the whirlwind of emotion spinning out of control inside him. Everything he needed was right here in his arms, and he kept thinking it, kept telling himself that this was happening, so he believed that it was real. He had found a beautiful woman, and he felt sure now that no matter what happened, she would try to make things work once he got his power back. She cared about him. She pressed her palms against his chest, heating it through his black shirt, and pushed away from him. He tugged her closer, tightening her grip on her backside, wanting to continue the kiss. There was a sparkle in her eyes, not mischief, but wickedness. He groaned, head spinning at the thought of her taking the lead. He had fallen in love with that take-charge attitude she had when it came to their relationship and him. Her hands grazed his arms, slowly edging downwards toward his, her eyes darkening with desire as her fingers traced the shape of his muscles through his shirt. She swirled her fingertips around his elbows and then along the underside of his forearms, and eventually the backs of his hands, her eyes holding his the whole time. He burned for her, hotter than an inferno, hotter than he had ever been with his power. Her hands caught his, and she eased them away from her bottom and stepped away from him. She took another step backwards, and then another, leading him towards the bedroom. He swallowed his nerves, refusing to let them get the better of him this time. They had been intimate once already. A second time was no reason for his knees to weaken and his limbs to tremble again. He could do this. He would take her into his bedroom and kiss her, touch her, and make love with her. He just hoped he didn't get too rough with her. His hard length throbbed against the confines of his black jeans, and he grimaced as he walked, following her into the bedroom. She smiled at him, amusement shining in her dark eyes, cutting through the desire, and he released her hands and slid the door closed, keeping the weather out. When he turned back around, she had removed the terracloth robe and was standing before him in only her camisole and panties. Gods! She laughed when he grabbed her around the waist, lifted her, and dropped her onto his double bed. She bounced in the middle of the dark red sheets, and he growled as he covered her body with his, settling atop her. Her laughter became a low moan, and she snaked her arms around his neck, tangled her fingers in his hair, and dragged his mouth down to hers. He kissed her again, harder this time, and leaned to his right so he could skim his left hand down her side. She giggled when he reached the curve of her waist, and the next thing he knew he was on his back with her astride him. He rolled his eyes closed, a moan leaving his lips over the delicious press of her thighs against his hips, and then flicked them back open when she started to unbutton his shirt. He loved the way she looked at him when she did that, gaze hot with desire, cheeks darkening and teeth teasing her lower lip, as though she thought he looked as delicious as he thought she did. She slowly popped each button, spreading his shirt little by little, revealing his body to her hungry gaze. For each button that gave, her eyes darkened, and her teeth pressed harder into her lower lip, reddening it. He wanted to kiss her, but he also didn't want to move, was enjoying being at her mercy. He had never met a woman like her. She knew what she wanted, and the look in her eyes said that she was damn well going to take it. Gods, he could just relax into the bed and let her ride him into oblivion. He could, but it wasn't in his nature to be so passive. He wanted to join in the action. She spread his shirt, the two sides falling away to reveal his torso. A flicker of hunger crossed her face, and he thought she might lean over and kiss his body. Her eyes raked over it, her breath coming faster, and he groaned when she lightly traced his muscles with her fingertips. He tensed for her, earning a low, appreciative moan, one that thrilled him. He would never tire of flexing his muscles if it got that response from her every time. "Hell, you're perfect," she whispered with a smile, and he grinned up at her. "Not really, but I like that you think I am." He ran his hands up her bare thighs and had to focus hard to stop himself from shuddering like a fool over the silky feel of her. When his hands reached her hips, she wriggled them,
rubbing her center against his caged erection. He rolled his eyes and groaned again. Was she trying to get him to make a fool of himself? You, on the other hand, are damn beautiful. She blushed, and he made a mental note to tell her she looked beautiful more often, because he loved the shy way she reacted to it. I want to unwrap you now. His heated words caused a deeper shade of pink to color her cheeks, and she smiled. How about I unwrap myself for you? She grabbed the hem of her camisole and tugged it over her head, revealing the smooth plane of her stomach and her bare breasts. Gods. Ares growled, sat up, and grabbed her around the waist. He bent her backwards and sucked her right nipple into his mouth. She moaned and arched against him, hot core rubbing his length, tearing a low groan from his throat. He needed out of his clothes. He needed her naked and against him, her legs wrapped around him as they made love. She wriggled again, and he couldn't take it. He pulled back and reached for his jeans, but she was there before him, hands tearing at his belt. She gently pushed his shoulder, and he flopped back onto the bed, letting her take command. She made swift work of his jeans, hooked her fingers into the waist of them and his black trunks, and pulled them down his thighs. She moaned again, and he looked down the length of his body at her. She had paused with her hands on his thighs, her gaze on his hard length. He flexed his hips, enticing her into doing what he wanted, and she flicked a dark, hungry glance at his face and then leaned over. Her breasts brushed his inner thighs, and he fisted the red sheets into his fingers, clutching them and bracing himself. The first soft brush of her warm, moist tongue along the length of his rigid shaft made him buck and moan so loud he was sure the neighbors would hear. He didn't care. They would be hearing far worse soon enough. The feel of her lips tracing the length of his flesh and her hands holding his hips down was too much for him to handle. He writhed beneath her, blood on fire and burning with a need to touch and taste her in return, to kiss her all over and join their bodies as one. She wrapped her lips around the soft head of his erection, and he couldn't take it. He grabbed her shoulders and pushed her up, and she frowned at him, but it melted away into a look of understanding. Slowly it is, she whispered, and feathered kisses down the length of his shaft and then his thighs. She shimmied backwards, taking his jeans and underwear with her, and then stepped off the end of the bed, pulled his clothes off his feet, and dropped them on the floor. His socks joined them, and so did her panties. She held his gaze the whole time she eased them down her long legs, revealing heaven to his eyes again. This time he was going there, and nothing, not even an apocalypse, would stop him. When she was naked, she climbed back onto the bed. He thought she would come up beside him, but she crawled up the length of his body, and he watched her, heart pounding frantically in his throat, his eyes glued on hers. She lowered her head when she reached his chest, pressing light kisses to his body, teasing him, and he settled his hands on her shoulders and then eased them downwards as she halted above him, her knees against his waist. Every inch of her was soft and smooth, warm and enticing. He wanted to touch all of her. He ran his fingers down her thighs, and she giggled, wriggling above him. It seemed she was very ticklish. Another thing they had in common. He hadn't lied to her the night he had paid penitence, and she had healed him. She sat back, and he couldn't contain the deep moan that rumbled up his throat as her hot core pressed against the length of his shaft. He bucked, thrusting along the length of her, and she moaned, her eyelids drooping. Her palms pressed into his chest, and she rotated her hips. He tensed and grabbed her hips, stopping her from moving. Too good. Gods, everything she did, even the smallest contact between them, threatened to push him over the edge. Her eyes flicked open, and she smiled at him, her look one of understanding again. She raised her hips off him, reached between them and grasped his cock, and he could barely breathe. His heart hammered in his throat, his eyes wouldn't move from hers, and he felt as though he might just die as the head of his length pressed against the entrance of her core. His breathing accelerated, blood thundering in his ears, and everything disappeared, leaving only him and Megan and this moment. She held his gaze and eased her body downwards, slowly taking him into her inch by agonizing inch. He wanted to go faster and slower all at the same time, wasn't sure whether to thrust home or savor their first connection. Her body was so tight around his, stretching to accommodate him, gloving him perfectly. So wet and hot and perfect. His balls tightened and he grasped her hips, halting her. She smiled again, leaned over him, and softly kissed him, the gentle sweeps of her lips over his, giving him something to focus on other than the fact that he was halfway to heaven. He tried not to think about that. He concentrated on the kiss, giving himself time to relax again. He was so focused on it, on tasting her lips, that he didn't notice she had moved again, taking him further into her welcoming heat. It was only when he felt her bottom brush his balls that he realized what she had done. His length throbbed, and she moaned, a little murmur of pleasure that tore him apart inside. He wanted to hear that sound again, needed to hear the pleasure she got from him inside her, one with her. She went to draw up his length, and he stopped her. There was no way he would be able to make this everything it should be if she remained in charge. He needed to take control and set the pace so he didn't end up making a fool of himself. She would do her best to draw things out and read his signals, but it would only take a split-second delay and he would come undone. He wanted her to find her pleasure first, before he took his. Gods, he wasn't sure he could manage it, but he was damn well going to try. He rolled her over, his broad body covering her slender one, and the shift in position and the way her legs instantly wrapped around his backside didn't help his cause. He groaned and buried his face in her throat, buying himself a moment to get his body back under control. She felt so good around him, hot and inviting, tight. She shifted, and her muscles flexed, showing him just how tight she could go, and he groaned and lightly bit her shoulder, trying to stifle the urge to release right that moment. He was not going to make a fool of himself. "You with me?" she whispered softly in his ear, and he nodded stiffly. She giggled. "I love the feel of you inside me." Aries groaned again. "That's not helping." She nibbled his ear. "Just take it slow. Or fast, whatever you want. It already feels so damn good to me." "Me too," he husked, and kissed her cheek. Her legs tightened around him, restricting his movements, and he leaned his weight on his elbows, keeping it off her. He could lay like this for hours with her, just savoring the feel of their bodies joined together. He kissed along her jaw to her mouth and captured her lips as he lay inside her, enjoying her heat and the way her body gloved his. She swept her lips across his and deepened the kiss, her fingers toying with the strands of his hair. "Gods, you feel good," he murmured against her lips, and felt her smile. "Like you were made for me." She leaned her head back into the mattress and searched his eyes. "Maybe I was. I thought there was that whole theory about Zeus creating everyone. Maybe he made me for you." He laughed. "My uncle isn't that nice, but I thank the fates I met you." "I do too." She twined her fingers in his hair and bit her lip, her cheeks coloring. "And I think you were made for me, and I'm going to keep you." He grinned, couldn't help himself as his heart kicked against his chest and his blood heated to boiling point. "You want to keep me?" he said, awed by that and the way she had said it, all serious and breathless. She nodded. "How about you? Want to keep me, big boy?" He grinned. "Forever." Her smile hit him hard. "Forever it is, then." Aries kissed her again, and she loosened her hold on his hips. He settled over her, his hands against her shoulders, and slowly withdrew, feeling every inch, and then eased back in. He hadn't lied. She felt incredibly good, and he was going to keep her forever, but not because of how she felt in his arms. He was going to keep her because he had fallen in love with her. She belonged to him now, and this moment would prove it, cementing his claim on her. She moaned and shifted her legs, running her feet up and down his thighs as he slowly thrust into her, kissing her the whole time. He didn't think he had ever made love before, not like this. This was making love, slow and deep, a connection that ran deeper than physical. He felt connected to her right down to his soul, all of him bared for her. He drew back and looked down into her eyes, wanting to see if she felt the same as he moved against her, withdrawing slowly and then surging forwards, thrusting all the way home. Her eyes were dark, glittering with warmth and tenderness, and he lost himself in them and the feelings they revealed. He wasn't alone. He could see all of her, nothing hidden, everything on display for him. Her body tensed around his, and she settled her legs around his hips, moved her hands to his face, and cupped his cheeks as he made love with her, easing in and out, her eyes locked with his. He wanted to kiss her again, needed it, but she held him firm, not letting him move. He groaned and clutched her shoulders, hips meeting hers with each slow thrust, her body soft and warm beneath him. "Aries," she whispered, breathless and beautiful. She frowned and her eyes closed, and then snapped open again and locked with his. The depth of her feelings shone in them, stealing his breath away, causing his movements to slow further. He flexed his hips, thrusting into her, and couldn't stop himself from opening to her, too. He wanted her to see how this made him feel, and how he felt about her. "Megan," he murmured, and she loosened her hold on him. He lowered his mouth to hers, kissing her as slowly as he was moving against her, and she moaned into his mouth, her breath hot and moist, and rocked her hips against his, countering his thrusts. The action tore a groan from him, and he slid one hand beneath her, pulling her back off the mattress and forcing her body against his. He thrust deeper, his pace quickening to match the rising tempo of hers as she undulated her hips, riding his cock. "Gods," Aries groaned, and devoured her lips, swallowing whatever she said in response. She pushed against his shoulder, and he went willingly, rolling onto his back and taking her with him. She didn't break their stride. She rose above him, her hands against his stomach, hips rotating as she eased up and down, taking him into her heat. He tensed and groaned, wasn't sure how much more he could take. She spread her legs further apart and moved faster, her eyes locked on his, holding him captive. He grasped her hips and helped her, moving her up and down, countering her thrusts, just as she had countered his. She groaned and tossed her head back, and his eyes were drawn to her pert breasts as they bounced. He wanted to devour them, sucking on her nipples and teasing them with his teeth until she screamed his name and climaxed. Another time. Next time. His fingertips pressed into her soft flesh, and she rode him harder, bouncing faster, and groaned each time their bodies slammed together. He sank his teeth into his lower lip, blood thundering with his racing pulse, tension ratcheting up with each hard plunge of her body onto his. "Aries," she moaned, and he loved the sound of his name drenched in desire and passion. He thrust harder, unable to find his voice to speak her name. His balls drew up and he groaned as she leaned back, her body tightening around his. He moved her harder, faster, lost and dizzy as he struggled to hold back the impending wave of his release so she could find hers. The feel of her clenching him, her core milking his cock, pulling at him, was too much. He growled and shoved her down hard onto his aching length. Release shot through him, hot and fierce, leaving him trembling as he pumped his seed into her. She moaned and kept moving, riding out his orgasm, heightening it until he couldn't breathe, and his heart was racing so fast he couldn't distinguish one beat from another. She grasped his right hand, brought it down, and guided it into her plush petals. He moved with her, rubbing her and teasing as her thrusts slowed. She moaned, writhing against him, and he could feel she was close, felt her tightening and clenching, her whole body going rigid. He squeezed her nub and thrust hard into her, slamming all the way to the hilt again, and she cried out his name, her body quivering and trembling with release. A long murmur of satisfaction left her as she slowly eased herself down, coming to lay with her chest against his, their bodies still intimately entwined. He smiled as she kissed him and ran his hands up and down her back, relishing the quiet moment of intimacy as bliss flowed through him. He shifted his hands to her bottom, and she drew back, a frown pinching her eyebrows together. "What?" he said, wanting to know why she was frowning when she should have been smiling from ear to ear like he was. She ran her fingers in circles on his chest. "Tell me you don't have to go out soon." He frowned now. "I don't. It's daylight, and there's no point in me heading out until I feel him anyway. Why are we talking about this right now?" She hummed and smiled at last. "Because I don't intend to let you leave this bed until we've done that at least another 3 times. He grinned. "That's a plan I can go along with." He rolled her onto her back and kissed her again, his body already hardening in anticipation of round 2. He had a few hours until sundown, and even then he wasn't leaving this bed until something happened to make him leave it. He was going to stay right here with Megan and make love to her until both of them were too sated to move. And then he was going to make love to her some more. Chapter 21. Megan lay on top of the covers on the double bed, her gaze tracking Aries as he paced the length of the bedroom along the dividing wall, his handsome face set in a dark scowl, and his delicious body on show. His brother had called when he had been dressing, catching him as he buttoned his jeans, and he was still on the phone now, close to half an hour later. She wasn't sure which brother it was, but Aries didn't sound happy. She wanted to crawl over to him and lure him down for a kiss, but he didn't look as though he would appreciate it. As soon as he ended the call, she was going to kiss him, though. It had been over an hour since the last time she'd had his mouth against hers, and she wanted it again. She wanted him again. Making love to him yesterday had been an eye-opener. She had thought she had been falling for him, but in reality she had fallen, and she had fallen hard. They had made love 4 times and fooled around for hours, learning each other's bodies, sharing with each other. She hadn't been able to keep a lid on her feelings at all, and neither had he. Everything he felt had shown in his beautiful dark eyes and echoed in her heart. He loved her. She knew that without him saying it, and she was fairly certain that he knew she loved him, too. Nothing had happened during the night hours. She had stayed up with him, tangled together on the couch, watching movies and kissing, and talking more about the underworld and his life. He fascinated her, and she had learned so much about him, and shared things about herself that she had never told anyone. She had never spent the evening with a man like that before. She had never sat with a guy and talked while he held her, laughed and poked fun at action movies, ate pizza straight out of the box, and eventually showered and then slept together. It had been perfect. Aries had held her so close to him while she slept, tucked safely in his arms, their bare bodies pressed together, until not a millimeter of air came between them. If this was what love was, then she had never been in love before. She felt connected to him, aware of him even when she wasn't looking at him, as though they were joined on a deeper level, an emotional level. He had talked about the Moirai, or the Fates as they were sometimes called, when they had been together watching movies on his couch, and the more he had told her about them, the stronger the feeling inside her had grown, the sensation that those three sisters had intervened somehow and made them for each other. It was the only explanation that made sense to her, because they seemed so perfect for each other, two halves of one soul. He glanced at her, and a smile instantly broke out on his lips, warming his dark eyes and chasing away his frown. Heck, she loved it when he looked at her like that. He had a way of holding her without even touching her that she had first noticed during the meeting with his brothers about the demon stealing his amulet. The way he looked at her, with an intense warmth in his eyes, gave her as much comfort as a physical embrace, held her from a distance, and made her feel loved. She crooked her finger, and he frowned then, but not from anger. He looked pained. She kneeled on the bed and crawled down the length of it to him. He paused before her, towering over her, his bare chest enticing her to touch it and start things up again. She was sure if she touched him, he would end his call in a heartbeat. He muttered something into the receiver and jerked his chin up, silently commanding her to come to him. She thought about refusing him, but she really wanted that kiss. She hooked her fingers into his belt and pulled herself up and him down at the same time. He slid his left hand around the back of her neck, clutched it hard, and tugged her up to him, his mouth claiming hers. The heat of the kiss melted her, and she grasped his arms. A moan escaped her, and a muffled voice broke the silence. Karis and he didn't sound happy about the interruption. Ares huffed and released her, and stared at her the whole time he paced and talked on the phone, his gaze locked on her. She knelt at the end of the bed, legs bare, wearing only her underwear and a navy t-shirt. His dark eyes fell to her legs at times, burning into her, stirring her desire. The man was insatiable, and she loved it. Centuries without making love hadn't dampened his ability at all, but she had a feeling it was more than just God-given talent at play. Whatever she felt when they made love, he had to feel it too. He had said she had been made for him. When he had told her that, she had wanted to confess her feelings and tell him that she loved him, needed him more than anything, but in the end she had only said that he had been made for her too. Had he really meant it when he had said he wanted to keep her forever? She had never considered entering into a serious long-term relationship with anyone, had always thought it was too dangerous because of her power to heal, that they would find out and it would destroy her when they left, or worse, informed the authorities. Whenever she looked at Ares now, his words floated around her head, taunting her with the possibility that it hadn't just been something he had said in the heat of the moment, but was something he meant with all of his heart. As far as she knew, she aged at a normal rate, and he was several 100 years old, but looked like he was in his late 30s. Forever was a possibility for him. Was it a possibility for her? The thought that it might not be, that she might age while he remained the same, and they would only have a few short years together before he fell out of love with her, cut her to the bone. She stared down at her legs and felt his eyes on her. He paused in front of her and fell silent. She knew he wanted her to look at him, but she couldn't, not while she was wrestling with her feelings. She wanted things to work out. But what hope was there? If his power didn't drive them apart, then her aging would. He crouched in front of her. "I have to go." He tossed the phone onto the bed, and she realized he had been talking to his brother, not her. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" He brushed his knuckles across her cheek, and she lifted her eyes to meet his. "I can't have forever with you." He frowned, his expression turning blacker than she had ever seen it, and red flared in his eyes, engulfing the dark of his irises until they blazed like fire. "Why not?" he snarled, and she shrank back. He didn't let her move away. His hand caught the nape of her neck, and he held her. "Because I'm mortal." She diverted her gaze, fixing it on the living room. Ares sighed and loosened his hold. "Is that all?" She turned back to him and frowned. I think it's a pretty big obstacle. He smiled, and her heart skipped a beat.
Not really. There are many paths to immortality.
He stood, caught her hands, and pulled her up into his arms. He held her bottom, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, and cursed him for distracting her with the hot, hard feel of his body against hers. He pressed a brief kiss to her lips and then drew back again, the fire in his eyes still raging like an inferno.
The easiest way is to take you with me when all this is over.
With you where? Oh, you mean the underworld? Megan couldn't imagine living down there. He had told her about it, and she had pictured a dark place full of dead people and flaming pits. His reassurances that parts of the underworld were as green and beautiful as parts of this world hadn't broken through that image lodged in her head. Immortality was one reason to venture into such a dark place, but she had another reason to go there with him, one that was infinitely more important to them both. Your fire wasn't a problem down there, was it? He shook his head, and she made up her mind right then, looking into his eyes, watching the way they flickered with fire, and knowing that he would always look at her this way, and that Diamond was right. Being here in this world, unable to touch Ares, would kill her. She wanted to be with him, and that meant she had to go to the underworld.
We'll talk about it more when it comes to it, he said, and she knew he was trying to avoid what he thought was going to be a painful conversation.
She wanted to tell him that she had already made up her mind, and she was going with him, would follow him to the ends of the earth, or at least into a different world, but he spoke over her.
Right now, I'm afraid you're stuck here with me.
You're stuck here? She hadn't missed the way he had said it. Not the usual flippant way people said that sort of thing.
Sorry, baby, you're stuck with me.
He had been deadly serious. He nodded.
Father banished us all. We can't enter the underworld again until we have fulfilled our mission.
That's terrible. I know you love him, but your father seems like a real asshole. The ground shook, and she clung to Ares, turning wide, fearful eyes on the pale apartment. I take it back. He chuckled into her ear, and was smiling when she looked back at him.
Don't let him bully you. He can't leave the underworld. You're safe. He can be an asshole, but everything he does it for a reason. The whole thing about the key of Hades being the amulet and banishing his sons from the underworld. He does it all to protect the two worlds.
He's still an asshole, but not a real asshole. She waited for the ground to shake again. It remained nice and stable, just the way she liked it. Noted. Ares set her down and looked her over.
Now, what was this about a packing discrepancy?
She blushed and wished she had never mentioned it. In her haste to leave her apartment with Ares, and in her lust-addled state, she had forgotten to pack some very basic items. Underwear. When she had told him that, he had smiled wickedly and said he wouldn't mind her going commando. While he might find the thought of her parading around without any underwear beneath her clothes appealing, she found it highly uncomfortable. But still, fetching her underwear meant returning to her apartment, and that demon, Amori, knew where she lived. Her gaze zipped to the outside world.
Demons don't like the sun, Megan,
Ares said, as though he had read her mind and knew her fear, and she nodded. It reassured her whenever he told her that, but each time it only calmed her for a few minutes, until she started wondering what would happen if clouds marred the endless blue sky and the sun went away. He grabbed a fresh black T-shirt from the long onyx chest of drawers that lined the dividing wall and pulled it on, hiding his body from her eyes. She tried to calm herself as she tugged her dark blue jeans on and then her socks and trainers. She tied the laces, repeating in her head that it was sunny and demons didn't like the sun. Amori had run away when it had been rising that morning. He wouldn't come after her, and even if he did, she had Ares with her.
We could just go shopping for new underwear,
Ares said with a naughty smile.
I think I owe you some.
He did, but shopping meant spending more time out in the open, and that meant there was a greater chance of it clouding over and a Maury coming after her. Megan shook her head. "You can still owe me." The smile he gave her said that he was thinking about very naughty underwear, and she rolled her eyes at him. "Ready?" He held out his hand, and she nodded, but a bubble of fear rose up and burst inside her. "I'll keep you safe, sweetheart." She took a deep breath and muttered, "I hate this bit." He smiled, wide and charming, the sort that made her insides flip and heat. "How about we go to your place without teleporting?" Without teleporting? She supposed they could take a taxi or public transport, but it would take a while to get to her apartment. She wanted to get there quickly. The fire in his eyes faded, and he looked across at his motorcycle. His gaze slid back to her, dark and sexy, hitting her with the force of a tidal wave. "How about a ride?" Her stomach fluttered, and she nodded, feeling lighter inside. "I haven't ridden it in a long time, but I know it starts." He walked away from her, pulled open one of the drawers in the bedroom, and rifled through it. He held a dark charcoal-gray jumper out in front of him, and then tugged it on over his head, and then grabbed a thick black woolen jumper and came back to her. He tossed it at her, and she caught it. "Put that on." Megan did as instructed. The jumper was huge on her, but she didn't care. It was warm and smelled faintly of him. She pressed the collar of the top against her nose and breathed it in. "I'll take the bike down and come back for you." He crossed the room to the beautiful black classic motorcycle, slung his leg over it, and had barely sat down on the black leather saddle before he disappeared in a swirl of black smoke. A second later he was back, charming as he smiled at her, and stalked across the room. She smiled back at him, still fluttering inside at the thought of going on his motorcycle, tucked close to his hard, broad body, feeling him under her fingers. He slid his arm around her waist, pulled her up to him, and meshed their lips in a brief, hard kiss. "You look as though you're about to pounce on me," he murmured against her lips, and she couldn't deny that the thought had crossed her mind once or twice since he had mentioned taking a ride. He took hold of her hand and linked their fingers, and she marveled at how safe such a small gesture made her feel. She loved the feel of his strong hand in hers, their fingers locked together, palms pressing against each other. The tightness of his grip made her feel he would never let her go, and would keep his promise that what they had was forever. She followed him out of his apartment, and it felt strange to cross the threshold in a conventional manner and watch him lock the door. He pocketed his keys and then led her towards the elevators. There was already a couple in the car that arrived, and they gave Aries and her a confused look, as though trying to place them, or wondering whether they were even residents in the building. She couldn't blame them. Aries had probably never used the stairs or the elevators. The doors closed, and Aries pulled her close to him and kissed her the whole time they were heading down to the lobby. In the past, she would have found kissing in front of strangers highly uncomfortable, but she was starving for the feel of his lips against hers, and took advantage of every second that his mouth was on hers. The doors opened, and she caught a glimpse of the horrified expressions on the couple's faces, and then Aries was tugging her towards the exit. She shivered as cold air washed over her, slender, icy fingers working through the gaps in the knit of her borrowed jumper and chilling her skin. She moved closer to Aries, and he placed his arm around her, pulling her into his side. She looked up at him, studying his profile as they walked along the street. He led her down a side street, and she looked ahead, spotting his bike parked there. "Get on," he said, voice a deep purr that stirred heat inside her. He wanted her to go on the front? She had imagined sitting behind him, her arms around his waist. The thought of him sitting behind her instead, his body pressing up against hers, caused the heat he had stirred to explode into flames. She swung her leg over the bike and couldn't resist settling her hands on the grips. He smiled at her as he tied his tawny hair back, and then got on behind her, his body sliding down the black leather seat. She ended up sitting on his thighs. Hell, he made a very nice seat, all warm and hard. He leaned forwards, his front pressing against her back, and slid his arms beneath hers, tight against her sides. She moved her hands off the bike and settled them on the fuel tank, stroking the lines of the flame paintwork. He gunned the engine, and the motorcycle roared into life beneath her, vibrations shaking her right down to her bones, causing bubbles of excitement to rise up and burst inside her. His chin came to rest on her shoulder as he revved the engine, and she leaned back against him. Had her father felt this excited whenever he had ridden his bike and heard the engine purr? She wanted to feel the cold wind on her face. "Don't fall off now," Aries said, close to her ear, and kicked the stand up. She snuggled into him, and he revved the engine again, and then they were moving. He took his left hand away from the motorcycle and settled his arm around her waist, pinning her to him. She smiled when he turned onto the main road, and they sped up, the motorcycle rumbling through the traffic. "Shouldn't we be wearing helmets?" she hollered over the noise of the vehicles around them and the roar of the motorcycle's engine. He squeezed her waist, and there was a grin in his voice. "Don't trust my driving, huh? I'll step if anything happens." She should have thought of that. Of course he would just teleport them out of danger. It took the edge off the thrill of riding so fast through the traffic, but gave her leave to sit back and enjoy herself at the same time, safe in the knowledge that nothing bad would happen. He wove through the yellow taxicabs and cars, gaining speed the whole time, until the breeze caressed her skin just as she had wanted, and she was smiling from ear to ear. The journey to her apartment didn't seem long enough. Before she had even begun to absorb how much fun it was to ride his motorcycle and contemplate getting one of her own, they were pulling up outside her building. He parked the bike and turned off the engine. "I could step up there for you," he said, breath hot in her ear, and she shook her head. She didn't want to go without him, or him without her. "You can do that steppy thing now." She held onto his arm and closed her eyes, and felt the darkness engulf her. When it disappeared, she landed on top of Aries on her bed. She rolled off and tossed him a chastising look, evading him as he tried to grab hold of her. "You did that on purpose." He smiled, sensual mouth tugging into it and heating her, chasing away her fear. "Maybe." She leaned over and kissed him. When he had melted into the bed and was breathing hard, she crawled onto him, teasing him with brief contact, and then off the other side of the bed. "You did that on purpose." He groaned and reached for her, but she dodged him again and went to her drawers. "Maybe." She pulled out various panties and bras, smiling inside each time he groaned again. "You're torturing me now." She was, and it was fun. She settled on taking all of her underwear and added some more jeans and tops to the mix, stuffing them into a small pack. He sat on the end of her bed, eyes tracking her every move, and she resisted the temptation to look at him, knowing that if she did, she would end up kissing him again, and that she wouldn't stop there. She zipped the bag closed, and he took it from her, loosened the straps, and slipped the backpack over his wide shoulders. He held his hand out to her, and she slipped hers into it, stepped up to him, and closed her eyes. The creepy sense of darkness and cold washed over her again, and then the sound of the world came back. She waited for the dizziness to pass. It disappeared faster this time. Was she getting used to teleporting with Aries? She opened her eyes and found him smiling down at her. "There she is. You're getting good at this. You'll be a pro in no time," he said, his smile holding and eyes warm with affection and what might have been pride. "How long does it normally take to get used to it?" He shrugged, drawing her attention to his broad shoulders, and she had to force her eyes back up, away from his body, before it roved over him and she had the urge to kiss him again. "I don't know. I've never teleported with anyone other than my brothers, and they're all used to it." He patted the seat of his motorcycle.
Your chariot awaits.
Megan smiled and sat on the bike, her fingers automatically returning to tracing the flaming pattern on the black fuel tank between her legs.
What are you thinking in there?
He slid on behind her, the action causing her to end up seated on his thighs again. She felt like mentioning that there were 2 seats on the bike, and she could sit on the back if it was easier and safer, but she was enjoying sitting on his lap too much to risk him taking her teasing to heart and making her switch positions. Only that it's such a short ride back to your apartment. He settled one hand on her stomach and his chin on her shoulder.
Would you like to drive?
She couldn't contain her grin. I would love to. Are you sure? He laughed.
I won't be letting you go off on your own, but I think you're ready for your first lesson.
He pressed a kiss to the spot below her ear and nuzzled her neck. Hold on, he whispered, and the world spun around her, drifting into darkness and then coming back again. Her head spun with it, and when it stopped, very different scenery surrounded her. It was hot and sunny, and looked like a different country entirely. Fields rolled around her, the endless scenery pierced by tall, thin, dark green trees. Heat and the scent of the earth washed over her, and she breathed deep of it, the smell and the picturesque beauty of the landscape relaxing her. Where are we? She looked over her shoulder at Aries.
Tuscany.
He said that very casually, and then grinned at her.
It has the best roads for riding.
Tuscany. Italy. She had trouble taking in the fact that he had just teleported them halfway around the world.
Now, time for your lesson.
He took hold of her hands and settled them over the grips, his hands covering hers. She tried to take in everything that he told her about the bike and how to change gears, accelerate, brake, but it was difficult when they were riding slowly through such beautiful scenery. They rode past ancient hilltop towns that looked like something straight off a postcard, and along snaking roads that cut through stretching uniform lines of vineyards. The warm sun beat down on her. Aries' deep voice in her ear made heat curl through her, and the world around her amazed her. She stared at it, not really listening to him, just feeling everything and letting it wash over her and soak in. They turned down a dirt road, following it through groves of trees and past more vineyards. His hands gripped hers on the handlebars, guiding her through each turn and slowly encouraging her to accelerate, and she felt suddenly aware of him. His thighs pressed against the underside of hers, his hard stomach and chest against the curve of her back. His breath tickled her neck, and his arms touched hers along their whole length. She fell silent, focused on him behind her, touching her, and he fell silent too as they raced onwards, throwing dust up behind them on the track. The air crackled between them, intense and laced with desire, passion that she struggled to contain. He slid his arm around her waist, leaving her in control of one side of the handlebars, and drew her closer. She tried to focus on driving, but the feel of his strong arm banded around her, his breath on her neck, and the thoughts racing through her mind collided and overwhelmed her. She hit the brake, causing the bike to veer left, and his hand grabbed hers, and he took control again, pulling the motorcycle over to the side of the track.
Gods, Megan, what on earth were you thinking?
He snapped, and she pushed herself up onto the fuel tank, twisted, and turned to face him. She slid back down the tank, settling with her bottom between his thighs, her legs astride his waist, and her front against his. I was thinking I need to kiss you, she breathed, and caught him around the nape of his neck, dragged him against her, and meshed her lips with his. He groaned into her mouth, grabbed her hips, and pulled her closer. She wrapped her legs around his waist, and he kicked the stand down, letting the bike settle. He kissed her harder then, stealing her breath away and stirring the heat inside her into flames that burned her with a need for more. She ran her hands down his chest, cursing the thick jumper he wore. She wanted to feel his body on hers. She needed to make love with him, right here and right now. She tugged the hem of his jumper up, and he broke away from her, breathing hard. He pressed their foreheads together, and his hands trembled against her sides. "What are you doing?" he whispered, and she kissed him again, trying to silence him and convince him to let her continue. He broke away again, catching hold of her upper arms this time so she couldn't get close to him. "You need some time away. I need some time away." She nodded. She could go along with that, anything to get him to kiss her again. If he needed an excuse to toss at his brothers, should they have a problem with what they had done, then he could use that one. They both needed a break from New York and the threat of Amari. She kissed him again and then broke away, causing Aries to frown at her. "What about the gate?" He kissed her chin, and then along her jaw, and devoured her neck, nipping at it with his teeth. She groaned and tried to keep her mind on track, but it was hard when he was cranking up her temperature and sending all her heat shooting towards the point where her hips pressed against his. "It'll be daylight there for hours yet. I'll have you home by nightfall. Just let me have this time with you before we go back," he murmured against her skin, and kissed her again, and she tilted her head back, willing to do whatever he said, as long as he kept kissing her like that. "I just need this time with you." "I need it too," she said, and he pulled back and stared at her. She righted herself and looked deep into his dark eyes, seeing the need he had spoken of blazing in them. It wasn't a physical need, but an emotional one, a need to feel the connection that blossomed between them whenever they touched or kissed, a need to know that they both felt something. They loved each other. They were just too scared to say the words. "I need this too. I want to forget New York and the demon and the gate and your brothers. I want to forget it all. I just want some time alone with you, without it all hanging over our heads. Just us." He smiled, and she stroked his cheek, hoping he could see down into her heart through her eyes, and knew she meant every word that she said. Just us. He leaned in and kissed her again, and she looped her arms back around his head. She lay back on the fuel tank, luring him with her and kissing him the whole time, letting her worries drift to the back of her mind as she focused on him and the feel of his lips on hers, his hands caressing her sides and her thighs, running up and down and teasing her. He kissed along her jaw, and she looked down the sloping vineyard to her left. It was quiet, not a soul for miles. He shifted his hands beneath her jumper and top, and cupped her bra-clad breasts as he kissed her throat, lips brushing it softly and making her shiver. She arched her body into his, rubbing her hips along his hard length in his jeans. She wanted that inside her, wanted to make love with him again. She had never considered public sex before. Back in British Columbia, the weather had been a factor that had put people off making out in their cars, let alone the open. After she had left there, she had spent most of her time avoiding relationships, fearing people would notice her ability. Now she couldn't get the thought of it out of her mind. It was warm, the sun was setting, and the world around them was silent. It felt as though they were the only people in the world. She bit her lip, feeling a little wicked and a heck of a lot excited. She wanted Aries, and she was going to have him. Right here, right now. Chapter 22. Megan ran her hands over Aries's jean-clad thighs and up his hips. She delved under his thick jumper and T-shirt and moaned as she reached skin. She traced the ridge of his hips, delighting in the feel of his body beneath her fingers, and then continued upwards until her hands met in the middle of his stomach. She still couldn't get over his physique. The man was sex on legs, a god in all ways. She purred at the feel of his muscles, and he groaned, pulled her back to him, and kissed her hard. She had enjoyed the times they had been gentle with each other, taking things slowly and learning each other's bodies, but it was the times when she pushed him over the edge that she had loved the most. He was always so hungry for her, his kisses relaying a desperate sense of urgency that echoed within her, as though he couldn't get enough and needed more, would never be satisfied. She looped her legs around his waist and pushed his jumper and T-shirt up. She wanted to see his body as well as touch it. He leaned back, ditched her backpack, and yanked his tops off, letting them fall onto the pillion of the bike. His muscles shifted, tensing and stretching, relaxing as he moved, and she drank in the delicious sight of him. He settled his hands on her waist again and stared at her, and she raked her eyes over him, tracking her gaze with her fingers as she followed the curves of his muscles up his arms to his shoulders. She focused on his left one when she felt the pronounced marking beneath her fingertips, and tilted her head to one side and traced the tattoo. It flowed over his biceps and the top curve of his shoulder, and it looked darker than she remembered. Was it just the evening light, or did it change color like his eyes did on occasion? She leaned in and kissed it, and he caught her around the nape of her neck and brought her mouth to his, capturing her lips in a fierce kiss. She moaned into his mouth, and he leaned over her, pressing her back into the fuel tank. His hands shifted beneath her jumper, pushing it up to reveal her breasts, and he bent his head and kissed them through her bra. She wanted more. She tugged the cups down to reveal her breasts, and he instantly swooped on her right nipple, tugging it into his warm mouth. She moaned and flexed her hips, rubbing against him and cursing her jeans and his. She wanted to feel him against her. He teased her nipple with his teeth, and she clutched the back of his head, holding him against her, and loosed another moan. His fingers tweaked her left nipple, torturing it into a hard peak, and she strained for more. The back of her head hit the instruments on the bike, but she didn't feel the pain. She only felt pleasure as Ares devoured her breasts, his low groans rumbling through her, and his strong hands working her to a frenzy. "More," she husked, desperate for him to take things further, hungry to have him inside her again. He didn't give it to her. She made a noise born of frustration, tangled her fingers in his overlong, tawny hair, and pulled him off her. She sat up and kissed him again, silencing him with it before he could say anything. Her other hand trailed down his body, and she groaned again, the feel of his hard-packed muscles causing her desire to spike. She curled her fingers, lightly raking her short nails down his stomach, and he growled, grabbed her around the back, and dragged her hard against him. His stomach and chest pressed against hers with each hard breath he drew, and she rocked her hips against him, needing more. She released his hair and decided it was time to take what she wanted, because she felt as if she would die if she waited any longer. She skimmed her palms down his chest, kissing him the whole time, and stopped at his belt. His kisses slowed. She made swift work of his belt and the buttons on his black jeans, angled her hand and slid it into his underwear, and moaned at the first caress of his hard length against her palm. He was silk and steel beneath her fingers, and she wriggled, slick with arousal and hungry for him. He groaned and shoved her onto her back again, the force of his actions knocking the breath from her, but sending her desire soaring at the same time. This was the side of him she had come to love the most, the one who seized command but always left her humming with satisfaction. He glared at her jeans and attacked them, pulling her belt open and unzipping them, grabbing and tugging them down, and she almost fell off the bike when he yanked them under her backside. She locked her hands around the handlebars behind her and held on as he pulled the trainers off, and her jeans quickly followed them. "Want you," she whispered, surprised at the sound of her desire-drenched voice. His eyes darkened, and he groaned. "Gods." She settled her bare legs either side of his, and then lifted one foot and ran it along the beautiful length of his rigid cock. It flexed against his stomach, and he moaned again, the muscles in his jaw popping, and his eyes darkening another shade, verging on black. Red spots appeared in them, and her heart fluttered, excitement rushing through her. "Want me?" She ran her toes up his erection. He grabbed her ankle, pulled her legs apart, and buried himself in her heat in one swift, hard stroke. She cried out and arched against the fuel tank. "Yes," he muttered into her ear, and grasped her bare backside, raising her off the seat. He leaned over her and kissed her breasts as he withdrew and slowly thrust back into her core. A moan escaped her, and she gripped the handlebars, stopping herself from sliding off the bike. She looped her legs around his back, her knees against his underarms, and tilted her head back, giving herself over to the pleasure flowing through her veins. He suckled her nipple and held onto her bottom as he thrust into her, hips flexing and driving him home. She closed her eyes and focused on where their bodies joined. It felt so good as he stretched her tightly around his cock, withdrawing almost all the way out of her before sliding back in, slowly and deeply, driving her out of her mind. She flexed around him, tensing and clenching him, tearing a low growl from his throat. "Megan," he moaned against her breast, and kissed across to the other one, lavishing it with attention as he plunged into her, hitting her deep in her core. She lowered her feet, pressed them against the passenger seat behind him, and pushed off him, countering his thrusts, riding him as he rode her, taking them both higher. He groaned and thrust harder, and she wanted to touch him, wanted to feel his powerful body flexing as he moved inside her. She sank her teeth into her lower lip and tensed again, and he jerked forwards, slamming hard into her, and groaned. He grasped her harder, fingers pressing into her bottom, and quickened his pace, long, fast strokes that threatened to have her screaming his name before long. She reached for release with him, raising her backside higher and spreading her legs so he could drive deeper into her, taking all of her. He grunted against his chest and pumped harder, faster, his tempo matching the frenzy in her blood. She moaned and joined him, thrusting down as he thrust up into her, their breathy murmurs of pleasure mingling in the evening air. He rolled her nipple between his teeth, and she cried out, unable to contain the burst of pleasure. He bit again, harder this time, and she quivered, close to the edge. A few more thrusts, and she would be there. She couldn't stop herself from seeking them, riding him harder, forcing him to move quicker and deeper. He growled again, and she clenched him, tearing a strangled moan from his throat. She liked that sound. She kept her body tensed around him, gloving him tightly, and his thrusts turned jerky, his breath coming in rapid, short bursts against her chest. He grunted with each plunge of his length into her, his pelvis hitting her aroused nub with each meeting of their hips, and she arched her back, her grip on the handlebars tightening. So close. She tensed her whole body and cried out his name as he thrust to the hilt, and pleasure slammed through her, sending her thighs quivering and heart bursting into overdrive. He curled his hips and kept pumping into her, taking her higher and drawing out her climax. She tried to keep her body tensed, wanted him to find the same mind-blowing release that she had experienced, but the bliss running through her was too good to deny, and she melted into the bike. His hips jerked forwards, slamming him to the hilt inside her, and he grunted as he climaxed, pumping his hot seed into her core. She moaned with him as he gave a few short thrusts, the feel of his length throbbing, adding to her pleasure, and then released her death grip on the motorcycle and wrapped her arms around his shoulders as he settled over her, his head resting on her chest. His hot breath skimmed across her stomach, and she smiled and looked down at him as she stroked his hair from his face. He was smiling too, his eyes closed and expression one of bliss. She kept stroking his hair, losing track of time as she watched him and slowly came down from the high of making love with him. The sun was close to setting when he finally lifted his head and looked at her. He pressed kisses to her stomach, his eyes locked on hers, red flecks shining in them. She knew right then that she would follow him anywhere, just as she had thought earlier. She would go with him to the underworld so they could be happy and be together with nothing standing between them. He withdrew from her and tucked himself away, She blushed and slipped down from the bike and dressed, tugging on her blue jeans and rearranging her tops. She shoved her feet back into her trainers and was about to tie her laces when he caught her around the waist and pulled her back onto the bike, so she was sitting side saddle on his thighs. He kissed her, slow and deep, each sweep of his lips laced with affection that stole her breath and made her feel light inside. The sun bathed the sky in gold and pink, warming the world and making her wonder whether she had ever had a moment this perfect in her life, or would ever experience one like it again. Aries wrapped his arms around her and pressed his cheek to the top of her head, and she looked out over the sloping vineyard to the setting sun. She leaned her head against his shoulder and savored the feel of him holding her, basking in the warmth of his affection. Her heart trembled, nerves threatening to silence her, but she fought them and let the words spill out. "I love you," she whispered, and waited, pulse ticking in her throat. And there it was, words she had thought she would never say, and she was saying them to a god of the underworld. A very silent god of the underworld. Damn. Had she moved too fast? She drew back and looked up at him. Red blotted out the brown in his irises, but they weren't hard with anger or any negative emotion. She had never seen them so warm and affectionate. Desire and love shone in them, heating her down to her heart and easing the erratic beat of it as calm washed through her. His eyes darted between hers, as though he needed to see in them that she had really just said that she loved him. Megan lifted her hand and stroked his cheek. His eyes and his expression told her that he needed to hear it again, needed to see her lips move with the words, in order to believe she had said them. "I love you," she whispered again. He frowned, tightened his grip on her, squeezing her against his chest, and spoke in his strange language. Her ears hurt, and she flinched away, unable to cover them because his grip on her restrained her arms. His look softened and turned apologetic. He raised one hand to her face and smoothed his palm over her cheek, settling his fingers along the curve of her jaw, and his red eyes held hers, flickering gold in places, mesmerizing her. "I love you," he husked, and then dipped his head, tilted her chin up, and kissed her hard. The ground shook. At first she thought it was a delayed reaction to him speaking the language of the underworld, but the trembling grew worse until she was forced to hold on to Aries to stop herself from sliding off his lap. He wrapped his arms around her and growled, the sound so feral and vicious that she hid in his arms, afraid of what was happening. Her eyes widened. The ground in the vineyard below her split, the jagged fault line racing up the hill directly towards her. She tensed in his protective embrace and curled up, afraid that the earth was going to swallow them both, and didn't breathe a sigh of relief even when the fault line stopped meters from them. Her breath lodged in her throat, mind unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The vines grew into tall, twisted trees, and the ground beneath them rose, both sides of the rift rising up until they formed a steep hill. The ground continued to shake, and Aries continued to growl, holding her close to him the whole time. The split down the middle of the vine-scattered hill widened, revealing darkness in its core, and a terrifying cacophony of strange screams burst out of it on a rush of cold wind. Megan squeezed her eyes shut and hid against his chest. What the heck was happening? "Do that steppy thing." "No," came the stern reply, and she peered up at him. There was no anger or fear in his fiery eyes, only resolve. She looked down the slope to the small, jagged hill and the dark cave it embraced. A sound like beating drums emanated from it, together with low, echoing shrieks. Her heart beat painfully hard against her chest, and she squeezed his arm, shaking him in an attempt to make him move. She didn't want to face whatever was coming out of that hole in the earth. A black hoof appeared, followed by another, forming the shape of a huge dark beast with glowing red eyes. A horse, but not like any she had seen before. It was immense, larger than any horse from this world, and it had a friend, an equally as black equine with bright crimson eyes. The two horses moved forwards, slower than should have been possible, as though someone had slowed down time. They tossed their heads, their black manes catching in the cold breeze coming from behind them and flowing forwards. Two more huge horses appeared behind them, and then another shape formed in the shadowy darkness. Megan's heart stopped beating. A man. The shadows clung to him, and the distance between them stole details, but she could still make out his tall, noble form and his pale, handsome face. His black cloak melted into the darkness as he raised an onyx-gloved hand with fingers tipped with points like claws, and the horses halted, the first pair in the light. He remained in the shadows, the light of the sun not touching him. Red eyes met hers, and she shrank back as a sense of power slammed into her. Ares's arms tightened around her, and she looked up at him, seeing the striking resemblance in their eyes. The horses shifted, kicking at the earth, and whinnied. She could feel the man's eyes on her still, boring into her, and she didn't want to look at him. His gaze unsettled her. Heck, it terrified her. She felt it move away, and glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He was too far away to make out any real detail about his features, but she didn't need to see him clearly to know who he was. Karis looked much like him, lithe and handsome, pale and dark at the same time. Megan frowned as the man slowly turned his head, his black crown melting into his equally dark hair at the base, but the long curved spikes reflecting what little light penetrated the darkness. Someone moved beside him, and her gaze darted there. A woman. The man held her hand, his black gloved one causing the woman's to partially disappear, and helped her down from whatever was attached to the horses. The woman walked towards the front pair of horses, and Megan expected her to remain in the darkness with the man, but she didn't stop. She walked past the horses and out into the evening light. Megan stared, a jealous hiss echoing in her mind. The woman was beautiful and flawless, youthful in appearance, and with skin as clear as milk. Long red hair flowed over her shoulders, curling at the ends, a stark shade against the sheer layers of her corseted black dress. She approached slowly, her steps light, and her green eyes glittering, fixed on Megan. Megan lowered hers. The woman's feet were bare, but that wasn't what shocked her. Red poppies and blue cornflowers sprung from the pale golden earth around the woman as she walked, erupting and blooming in a heartbeat, bright and colorful and beautiful. Ares leaned back and held Megan closer. She looked up at him again. He was still staring at the man, a wary edge to his red eyes. The woman halted a few meters down the slope, halfway between the dark horses and them. She spoke, and Megan covered her ears, wincing as they hurt. Ares spoke back to her in the same strange language. The man remained in the shadows, the huge horses restless and wild, their red eyes matching his. He stared at her, unwavering, menacing. She shivered and felt Ares's attention shift to her. He snarled in the direction of the man. "Ares," the woman said, and Megan's eyes widened at the beautiful, soft melody of her voice. "Your father means her no harm, and you know that."
"Why is father here?"
Ares didn't relinquish his hold on her, or move his glare away from the man he had called his father. Megan didn't want to look at him again, but her eyes ignored her commands and shifted back to him. He stared at her still. "You know in your heart why." The woman tilted her head, looking back over her slender shoulder. "Hades is concerned. You spoke our language. What you said—"
"I meant it,"
Ares interjected, and looked down at Megan. She tore her eyes away from the man and looked up at him.
He brushed his knuckles across her cheek. "I love her, and she is mine. Forever. I will not change my mind."
"Is that what this is about?" Megan looked over at the woman. Persephone, she presumed, although she didn't look old enough to be Ares' older sister, let alone his mother. "Because he loves me? You know of my son's problem." "I do. And what about it? He'll get his power back. We'll stop this apocalyptic event from happening, and then his father will let him back into the underworld." "And what will happen to my son then?" Persephone said, a sense of darkness in her tone. Megan frowned at her, and her insinuation that she would leave Ares and hurt him. She wrapped her hands around his bare arm and held on to him. "I'll go with him."
"You will?"
Ares said, and she smiled up at him, seeing the shock that had been in his voice reflected in his eyes. "I will." She had barely finished speaking when Ares kissed her, his mouth mastering hers and making her forget about their company. She kissed him back, lips playing against his, absorbing his love and how happy she had made him with only 2 words. He had looked happy and shocked when she had said that she loved him, but it hadn't compared with the joy that had shone in his eyes when she had admitted she was going to go with him to the underworld. The horses whinnied. Persephone cleared her throat. Ares broke away from Megan and stared down at her, his bare chest heaving as he breathed hard, and his eyes twinkling with affection. A dark voice rolled over her, the language blacker than it had ever sounded when Ares spoke it, and she stuck her fingers in her ears, trying to block out the words. Her head ached and felt as though it was splitting in 2. Ares pulled her close to him, pressing her right ear to his broad chest and covering her left ear with his hand. Persephone turned away, flowing back down the hill and then into the darkness. The pair of horses at the front reared and kicked out, and then turned, heading back into the rift. Megan caught a brief flash of the black chariot they drew, and Persephone standing beside Hades on it, looking back at her, and then the earth shook. The ground healed itself, and the hill flattened, the vines returning to their original form. The poppies and cornflowers remained, waving in the evening breeze. "Sorry," Ares whispered, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Father doesn't speak the mortal languages." Megan emerged from his embrace and stared up into his beautiful dark eyes. "When I go with you to the underworld, will it still hurt me?" He shook his head and gently stroked her cheek as he inspected her ears, worry written across every handsome line of his face. "No. You will understand it, and it won't hurt you." "That's a relief. Or it would be if your father wasn't so damn scary. Is he annoyed with me because I called him an asshole?" He smiled at last. "No. He looks at everyone like that. You come to learn the subtle differences in his expression. That was concern." "Concern?" She stared at the vineyard, trying to figure out just how his expression had been anything like concern. He looked as though he wanted to murder me. Ares chuckled, a rich, throaty sound that made her smile too. "He is very protective." Her smile widened, and she stroked his bare chest, teasing him with the light touch, and held his gaze. "I guess that runs in the blood, then." He growled and kissed her, hard enough to leave her breathless. "It does," he whispered against her lips. "I want to kill anyone who looks at you, even my brothers, even my father." She shivered from head to toe, heat curling through her. She had never had a man act possessive of her before, and she discovered that she liked it. She liked that Ares wanted to protect her from the world, and that he had stated she belonged to him, and that he would do anything to keep her. It made her feel loved and cherished. Special. "What did he say?" She looked back at the vineyard again, her curiosity getting the better of her. She had just met his parents, and his father had clearly had something to say about her and where their relationship was heading. She hoped she had reassured them both that she didn't intend to break their son's heart. "He wants to meet you,"
when you're ready."
He pressed another kiss to her hair and held her closer. She leaned her cheek against his chest. "I don't think I'll ever be ready to meet your father. No offense, but he scares the crap out of me."
He laughed. "You get used to him, and he won't hurt you. I'll make sure of that."
She leaned back and raised her eyes to his, needing to see the silent promise in those words. He really would protect her from anyone, even his father. She settled her hand on his cheek and swept her thumb along his lower lip. "It must be nice, having a protective family. They all seem to look out for you."
She wasn't sure where that one had come from, and wasn't prepared for the pang of jealousy mixed with loneliness that accompanied it.
He sighed and curled his fingers around her shoulder, holding her.
"You're not alone now, Megan. I will protect you, and I will look out for you, and in time my family will become your family, too."
She had never considered that, but she found that she liked the idea, even if some of his brothers and his father scared her a little, and even if it did seem as though it would be a long time before they accepted her. Aries fell silent, and his expression turned pensive, his dark eyebrows meeting hard and causing his eyes to narrow on her. What was he thinking to make him look so deadly serious all of a sudden?
"Did you mean what you told my mother?"
he said in a low voice, one edged with a touch of darkness and a demand to answer him honestly. She smiled and shook her head. "Do you think I'd lie to get rid of your parents?"
"It crossed my mind."
She sighed, lifted her hands, and held both of his cheeks, keeping his gaze locked on her. They had both been alone too long if they had difficulty believing the things they said to each other. "I meant it, Aries." His look softened, and his voice dropped to a whisper.
"Tell me again. Look in my eyes and tell me, will you come with me to the underworld?"
She held his gaze, looking deep into his eyes, and nodded. "I will." His sensual lips curved into a wide grin, and then he kissed her. She had just started to melt into him when he moved her on the saddle, easily lifting her and settling her on his lap, her legs astride the fuel tank. She blushed. She would never look at his bike the same way again. He shuffled behind her, leaning back, and his jumper brushed her right arm as he dressed. When he bent down to his left, she looked over her shoulder at him, curious about what he was doing. He snagged her backpack and put it on as he righted himself, and then slid one arm around her waist.
"Hold on tight."
"Wait," she said, and he relaxed against her back. "We will live in the nice part of the underworld, though. Not the bit with the dead people?"
He chuckled into her ear. "Of course. You'll have free rein to make my palace—"
"You have a palace?" She craned her neck and looked over her shoulder at him.
"You thought I lived with my parents? I'm 934. I haven't lived with my parents in centuries."
The incredulous but horrified look in his eyes tugged a smile from her. He scowled at it. She couldn't help it. She had never heard a man sound so mortified, and he had just given away his exact age. She frowned. "You do realize you're 901 years older than me?" He shrugged.
"Men are meant to go for younger women. It's natural."
"A 900-year age gap is natural?" She shook her head. "I think I have to reconsider this whole relationship."
Aries growled at her, the sound dark and vicious, warning her that he hadn't taken that as a joke. "You're mine. You will come with me to the underworld and live in my palace, and there you will stay with me."
Her whole body flushed with heat, a shiver bolting through her, caused by the possessive snarl in his tone, and the thought that he would never let her go now that he had her. "You sound like your father." She smiled, but he didn't. She had forgotten he didn't like it when people said his father had abducted his mother. She ran her hands over his thighs and leaned back against his chest, wanting to lighten the mood and ease his anger. "Say it again."
"You're mine,"
Aries purred into her ear, and she shivered again. Forever. Megan smiled. She liked the sound of that and the thought of sharing a palace with Ares, sharing his world. She held on to his arm around her waist and relaxed against him, warm all over, heated from her heart outwards by the thought that she was no longer alone. All they had to do was get his power back and stop whatever event the oracles had foreseen, and they could have what he had promised her. Forever. The world swirled into darkness. Chapter 23. It had been almost a week since Amori had stolen Ares's amulet, and he hadn't shown up in the city again yet. It had been a few days since Megan had said a handful of words that had changed Ares's world, and he hadn't stopped wanting to kiss her yet. She snuggled closer to him, slipping her arms around his waist beneath his long black coat and tilting her head back, her eyes dark in the low light coming from the nearby path through the park. He wrapped his arms around her, dipped his head, and kissed her, claiming her mouth in the way he wanted to claim her body again, rough and possessive, stamping his mark on her. She purred against his lips, a murmur of pleasure that echoed within him. He shifted one hand to between her shoulder blades and frowned at how cold the leather of his spare holster was. He touched her shoulder and found her dark red jumper was cold too. He reluctantly released her and pulled his coat off. It had arrived as a special delivery this morning, sent from Tokyo with Escher's name on the return address label. Ares understood why Escher was keeping his distance and hadn't brought the new long black coat to Ares himself. The moon was full now and would be affecting Escher's mood, turning it blacker than it was on a normal day. He didn't want Escher around Megan when he was likely to lose his cool. Gods only knew what Escher would do to Megan should their paths cross while he was under the sway of the moon. He looked down at her. She stood before him, her expression soft and warm with affection, speaking openly of her feelings for him. He wanted to kiss her whenever she looked at him like that, and it was hard to resist the urge that tore through him and tamp it down. They had come out to the gate every night over the past week and waited to see if the demon would show his face. Hanging out with her had driven Ares crazy, and he had given in to his desires every time, spending most of the night making out with her in the concealing darkness of the park. "I still don't see why I have to carry this thing." She nudged the silver gun hanging under her left arm, a dark look on her pretty face. He settled his coat around her shoulders. "Because I say you do. I know you don't like them, but you're a good shot, and I want to know you're safe if anything happens." "Like Amori showing up? Maybe he's gone to a different gate?" She slipped her arms into the sleeves of his coat. "He wouldn't. Each amulet is different and specific to one gate." He pulled the coat closed across her chest, his knuckles brushing her breasts, threatening to get his motor revving again. His gaze dropped to her kiss-swollen lips, and he wanted to scoop her up into his arms and devour them. She gazed down at the hem of the coat. It dragged on the wet grass, and she grabbed the material near her hips and raised it. "We'll have to get me one of my own." She smiled up at him. He started to smile back at her. A coppery stench hit him, sending his gut swirling. Ares slowly turned to face the demon, unsurprised to see it was Amori standing on the path under the streetlights, brazenly holding his damn amulet. He took a step back and moved to shield Megan, partially blocking her from view as he stared the demon down. "You know I can't let you use that to open the gate." Amori's hazel eyes slid to Megan, and then back to him. "Move aside, or your girlfriend is toast." His free hand caught fire. Ares stood his ground, refusing to give in to his threats. He expected Megan to move behind him, but she bravely remained standing in the same spot, half exposed to Amori. She looked down, and Ares frowned. Was she staring at his backside? She couldn't possibly be gawping at him at a time like this. A quiet beep reached his ears, and he smiled inside, an arrow of pride hitting him in the heart as he realized she had just used his phone. That was his woman. Black smoke swirled beside him as Diamond appeared, the dark ribbons caressing the shoulders of his black coat, trailing over the spikes of his white hair, and curling around his gloved hands. Amore scowled at him and then threw his hands forwards, unleashing a blast of fire. Diamond easily countered it, creating a wall of ice in front of him and Ares with a casual sweep of his hand. The demon shrieked, teleported right in front of Ares, and all hell broke loose. "Protect Megan!" Ares threw himself at Amore, tackling him to the ground. They rolled together, both throwing and landing wild punches, and then broke apart. Ares came up on his feet, ending up facing Megan and Diamond, Amore between them. Megan's beautiful face contorted into a vicious sneer, and she drew the gun he had given her. "I can protect myself. You two focus on him." When had his woman taken command of this situation? He attacked Amore again and flicked Diamond a look that warned him not to obey her. This was his fight. "Are you going to help him or not?" Megan scowled at Diamond. "Not." Diamond's cold voice cut through the darkness. "I like my balls where they are." "This does not fall under that dumb fuck with Ares and he fucks with you rule that you all follow." Megan waved the gun in Diamond's face. Amore used Ares's distraction against him, barreling into his stomach and taking him down, landing on top of him. The blond male grinned at him and punched him hard, knocking his head to one side. He punched him again with his other hand, knocking it the other way, and Ares growled. Maybe a little help wouldn't hurt. A loud crack broke the still night, echoing around the buildings. Ares cursed under his breath at the same time that Diamond cursed out loud, and the demon shrieked and teleported, leaving the powerful stench of his blood in the air around Ares. He should have put a silencer on the damn gun. Megan stood before him, both hands locked around the weapon, her eyes enormous. The gun shook wildly in her grip, and Diamond took it from her and pocketed it. Ares scanned the darkness, trying to track Amore. The demon wasn't going to give up now, not even when he was injured. He would still attempt to get the gate open with the amulet. "Where is he?" Diamond's pale blue eyes searched for their prey. Ares got to his feet and sniffed. The disgusting smell of demon blood hit him hard, but this time he grinned rather than grimaced. It didn't matter if Amore made a break for it now. He would easily be able to track him when he was bleeding so badly. A bright flash of light exploded off to Ares's left, and a blast of heat and cold swept over him. He rolled to his right, coming to his feet close to Megan and Diamond. His younger brother had his hand held out in front of him, his black leather glove coated in sparkling frost. Ares's gaze snapped to the melting wall of ice just yards from where he had been standing, and then thanked his brother with a glance. The ice shattered and fell to reveal Amore on the other side, his lips twisted in a sneer, and his eyes glowing around the edges, shining from the dark depths of his gray hood. Ares ran at him, and he turned, sprinting away, towards the gate. He gave chase, boots pounding the wet grass, and heard Diamond and Megan running to catch up. He didn't want Megan near Amore or the fight, but he needed Diamond as backup, and he was damned if he was going to leave her unprotected. Amore launched a round of small fireballs at him, peppering the air with them, and Ares focused and stepped, disappearing and reappearing in the tight gaps between them. Megan shrieked behind him. The sound cut off. His heart slammed to a halt against his chest, and then kicked back into action when she appeared a few meters off to his right, closer to the gate. Diamond swept his eyes over her, evidently checking for damage. Ares growled, his mood degenerating as thoughts of her injured crawled through his skull. Such a brief trip with Diamond shouldn't hurt her if she hadn't touched his hands, but he couldn't be sure. He glanced at her, and she looked all right, but his mood didn't improve. It only worsened. The sight of Diamond shielding her with his body, keeping her tucked close behind him, sent him off the deep end. Megan was his. A piercing flash of purple light burst in the darkness, blinding him for a second. When his vision came back, Amaury had halted and was facing him, a grin spreading his lips. The gate. It expanded, the two rings swirling in opposite directions, filling with shining, colorful glyphs as it began to open in this world, hovering horizontally a few feet off the wet grass. Ares dodged another round of fireballs and kept running at Amaury, intent on taking him down before he could try to use the amulet. The gate had appeared because of his presence and proximity, not because of the amulet, but Amaury clearly thought it was the latter that had caused the gate to materialize. He had to keep it that way but stop him from taking things further, maintaining the ruse that the amulets had power over the gates, because he wasn't convinced that Amaury was working alone. He stepped, the world swirling into darkness and then coming back again, and appeared in the air above Amaury. He landed hard, catching the demon in the chest with his boot and sending him slamming into the ground under his full weight. Amaury shrieked again, and the scent of his tainted blood grew stronger in the cold air. The demon tossed his hand upwards, and Ares teleported again, barely avoiding the blast of fire. When he reappeared again, Amaury was on his feet and heading straight for him. Ares closed the distance between them before he could use his power again, and caught him hard with a right hook, followed by a swift left uppercut. Amaury stumbled backwards, and Ares advanced, punching and kicking, landing blows that would have killed a mortal, driving Amaury away from the gate. It began to shrink again, its light growing dimmer. Amaury looked beyond Ares, the colorful, swirling lights of the gate reflected in his eyes, and growled. Ares turned the tables on him, using his distraction to his advantage. He lunged for the silver amulet he held, and managed to catch hold of the chain. Amaury yanked it away from him, and the chain snapped, but Ares didn't give up. He made another lunge for him, this time going for the gold and red amulet he wore around his hand, the one linked to his power. He had to stop him from trying to open the gate one way or another. Amaury swept his hand out, and an invisible blast struck Ares in the chest. The world took a tumble and then exploded in pain as he hit the ground hard and rolled. He stopped himself in time to see Amaury sprinting towards the gate. Diamond flung both hands out, unleashing several spears of ice. They impacted around Amaury, slamming into the earth and tearing it up. Ares pushed onto his feet. One of the spears struck its target, catching Amaury in his right calf, and the demon shrieked and turned bright, glowing eyes on Diamond. Not Diamond, Ares realized with dread. He would go after Megan. He would force her to heal him. Diamond broke ranks and moved forwards, placing distance between him and Megan. Ares focused on her and stepped. The darkness parted to reveal her standing before him, her eyes wide and fixed beyond him, horror shining in them. Diamond's agonized scream hit him, chilling him to the bone, and he turned. Amaury stood a few meters away, his hand locked around Diamond's throat. Diamond fell to his knees and flung his head back, crying out again as Amaury's hand shone with dazzling rays of blue and white. "Diamond!" Ares kicked off, intent on helping his brother, and something slammed into his chest. Pain tore through him, knocking him to his knees. He arched backwards and roared at the night sky, an inferno coursing through his flesh, blazing in his veins. The familiar heat of fire flickered over his hands, and the world brightened, bathed in bright hues of orange and yellow. Ares dropped his chin and snarled at Amaury. The demon released his brother, and Diamond fell into a heap on the grass. Ares roared and unleashed twin swirling funnels of fire. Amaury leaped backwards, grinned, and swept his hand out. A shield of ice formed in front of him, and Ares' fire slammed into it, instantly melting it, but dying at the same time. Marek had been right. Amaury's power had its limits. He had taken Diamond's, but had been forced to give up Ares's to do so. It hadn't changed a thing, though. They still needed to capture Amori and take the amulet back, and Diamond's power, too. And it was still a battle of fire against ice. Megan was past Ares in a heartbeat, sprinting towards Diamond where he lay unmoving on the ground. Ares stepped and appeared in front of Amori, releasing another blast of fire just before he finished teleporting. It caught Amori in the chest and knocked him flying into the darkness. 3 spears of ice shot out of the shadowy night, and Ares targeted each one with a spear created of fire, melting them before they could hit their marks. "Diamond?" Megan said, her voice loud in the darkness, and Ares forced himself to remain focused on his fight against Amori. Amori reappeared again and made another break for the gate. Ares teleported and appeared in front of him, blocking his path, and threw his right hand forward, unleashing an orb of fire. His left followed it, releasing a second one as Amori worked to block the first. The second orb hit the wall of ice he hastily constructed and blasted through it, catching Amori's right shoulder and sending him spinning. "I want him dead," Diamond growled, and relief poured through Ares. His brother sounded pissed, but he was alive. "Gladly," Ares said, loud enough for him to hear, and attacked again, countering another blast of ice that Amori sent shooting towards him. Ares swept his hand in a low arc, igniting a burning trench between him and Amori. Amori laughed. "This is not going to stop me." Ares hadn't intended it to. He wanted to corral the demon and force him to move to a spot on his right, near the trees and away from Megan and Diamond. "I don't need you to heal me, woman." Diamond's gravelly voice cut through the night, and Ares struggled to focus. He didn't want Megan to use her ability on him either, and not because the thought of her touching his brother sent him into a black rage. Healing him the night they had met, and afterwards, when he had paid penitence, had taken so much out of her, and he was worried that doing the same for Diamond would hurt her. Amori teleported closer to Diamond and Megan, and Ares swept his hand out again, forming a flaming barrier between them and the demon, driving the demon towards him and the gate. Amori snarled and ran at him, his hands pale with frost. Ares waited. "Don't touch me," Diamond growled, and Ares silently backed up those words. What Megan wanted to do was a noble and beautiful thing, but it would leave her weak and vulnerable when he needed her strong. "Stubborn woman." Ares agreed with that, and caught a glimpse of Megan with her hand on his brother's neck. He growled and teleported. It was hard to ignore his instinct to step to her and not his opponent, and he ended up between the two of them, his back to Amori, leaving the gate wide open. Amori skidded to a halt in front of the gate, where it stretched over the grass, the 2 main rings turning slowly in opposite directions. The demon pushed his hood back, the colorful light from the gate playing across his face, and held the silver amulet out. The black part of the disc shone. Ares kicked off and slammed into Amori's side, grunting as he took the demon down. He landed on top of him, cocked his right fist, and smashed it hard into his face. Amori raised his hands to protect himself, black blood pouring from his nose, and Ares thanked him for letting down his defenses. He snatched the silver amulet and tore it from the demon's grasp before he could react, and focused on the gate. It began to shrink again, the 2 rings turning quickly and the glyphs disappearing. Amori snarled and shot a hand out at him. Ares evaded it and tried to grab the golden amulet he wore against his palm, but the demon released a blast of frigid air, forcing Ares to teleport in order to avoid a direct hit. He landed on the grass a few meters away from the rapidly shrinking gate and breathed hard, his eyes locked on the place where Amori had been and was now gone. Teleported. Where? Long, twisting spikes of ice shot out of the air, heading not for him, but for Megan and Diamond. Ares stepped and appeared in front of them, sweeping his arm out at the same time and using all of his strength to form a thick dome of fire over his woman and his brother. The flames faded, and water rained down on him, drenching him and the others. Amori ran. Ares focused on him, intent on giving chase before he could escape. "Stop!" Diamond's voice cracked the heavy silence and sent a chill down Ares' spine. He turned slowly, his heart a dark throb in his chest, fear crawling over his skin. His eyes fell on his younger brother, and then dropped to Megan. She lay on the ground, curled up on her side, her skin as pale as the moon as she shivered violently. Diamond looked up at him. "I tried to stop her." Ares fell to his knees beside her and reached out to pull her against him. He barely stopped himself in time. He had his power back. He couldn't touch her. He stared at her, heart clenching in his chest, mind swimming. How had this happened? It wasn't the drain from her power. She was freezing, her lips dark and skin pale. She had mentioned he was hot before, and he had thought nothing of it at the time, but it haunted him now. What if Amori had taken his power, but not entirely? His power had become a physical part of him, and so had Diamond's ice. Was it possible that they had retained part of their power, the one that changed their body? "You still feel cold, don't you?" he said to Diamond, and he nodded. "Not as much as before, but I still feel it. I tried to stop her." Diamond's pale blue gaze slid back to Megan, filling with remorse. "I no longer envy your days without your power. I'm damn well getting mine back." Ares looked down at Megan, and then at his brother. "Go and get the son of a bitch. I'll be right behind you." Diamond stood, his eyes remaining fixed on her. "We good here?" "We're good." Ares forced himself to nod. Megan had chosen to heal Diamond. Neither of them had known that she would end up freezing. He had no reason to be angry with his brother, even when he wanted to blame this on him. Diamond disappeared. Ares stared at Megan, unsure what to do. She had been able to withstand Diamond's ice when he'd still had his power. He prayed to the gods that she could do the same with fire. Chapter 24. Megan regretted insisting she healed Diamond the moment her hand touched his throat. She should have listened to his protests and seen there was a reason he didn't want her to touch him, and it wasn't just because he was stubborn and a man, and the combination of those two things meant he couldn't show weakness in front of a woman. The heat leached from her fingers, and then cold swept up them, creeping towards her palm where it rested over his Adam's apple. She focused, hoping it would combat the cold, but it only made it worse. Her fingers numbed and then stiffened, freezing and burning at the same time. A fiery wall surrounded them, and the heat of it warmed her for a brief few seconds. But the moment it faded, the ice in her blood spread up her arm, and she collapsed, chilled to the bone. "Stop!" Diamond snapped, and Ares turned and looked down at her, and was by her side in an instant, a pained look in his eyes. Her teeth chattered, clashing loudly enough to fill her mind with the sound, and she held herself, fighting the cold and refusing to give in to it. She stared at Ares, watching him interact with his brother, and then returned to looking at her. Diamond disappeared, leaving them alone. The edges of Ares's irises glowed red, the fire spreading towards his pupils. She focused on them, on the determination that shone in them and the love. He would never hurt her. She knew that in her heart, but she had seen him fight with his fire. He had it back now. If he touched her, he would hurt her, regardless of what he wanted. She shivered and held herself, her clothes soaked by the water that had fallen when Ares had protected her and Diamond from the ice Amori had hurled at them. "Freezing," she mumbled, and blinked, staring into Ares's flaming eyes. "I know, sweetheart," he whispered, his deep voice soft and warming her to a degree. He closed the distance between them and kneeled beside her on the cold, damp grass. He ran his gaze over her, his expression intent and serious, his lips compressing into a thin line. She swallowed when he held his hand out over her. "Roll onto your back. Can you do that for me?" Fear lanced her, but she did as he ordered, slowly easing onto her back and trying to convince herself to relax and trust him. "Stay still now, and not a sound, understand? I need to focus. This'll take a lot of concentration." He lowered his hand towards her, and she shivered despite her attempts to keep still. His dark eyebrows knitted together, and his eyes glowed brightly, the fire flickering in his irises turning from red to burning gold. The air around his hand shimmered. Heat caressed her body, barely noticeable at first, but then as warm as the sun on a summer's day. He moved his hand, and her clothes dried wherever he went, her skin warming and muscles relaxing. Stunned didn't cover how she felt as the ice in her veins melted and her shivering subsided. She stared up at him, amazed once more by his power. The concentration it took for him to control his fire was visible, the effort behind what he was doing etched on his handsome face for all to see. His eyes brightened, turning to flickering white and gold, and he snatched his hand back. "It's all I can do." He breathed hard, and the fire in his eyes began to fade. Curiosity got the better of her, and she touched his hand before he could move it beyond her reach. It was so warm, hotter than before. "No." He tried to yank his hand from her grip, but she held on to him, and he stilled. His eyes locked on their joined hands, and she stroked his fingers, studying them. Such heat! She liked the warmth and how it flowed into her. "How?" he whispered, and she wanted to ask the same thing. She didn't have an answer for him. He raised his other hand and covered hers, trapping it between them. Glowing amber flames appeared and licked her skin, and she expected them to burn her, but they didn't. They tickled. "Warm," she said, fascinated by this turn of events. "Immune." He frowned, and she wasn't sure whether to believe that. It sounded too good to be true. Was it possible that she could withstand his heat? She had managed to touch Diamond without hurting herself too, something that had surprised Diamond, Merrick, and Aries at the time. The flames grew and spread. The cuff of the dark red jumper she wore beneath his coat caught alight. "Ow!" Megan tugged her hand free and swatted the burning cuff, putting the fire out. She pulled the unharmed sleeve of his coat and the charred woolen jumper back and stared at the blistered skin on her wrist. Aries reached for her and then drew back again. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched you." She placed her hand over the burn and looked up into his eyes, hating the pain that shone in them. "It wasn't your fault. You didn't hurt me." "It was my fire that burned your clothes." "My own curiosity, more like. Why didn't you burn me?" She glanced down at her hand, and then his, tempted to reach out and touch him again. "I did." "No, I mean, when I held your hand. It was hot and it tickled, but look." She held her hand out to him. "It didn't burn." "I don't know." He ghosted his hand over hers, and warmth caressed her skin. "I burn all who touch me with the exception of Diamond, and sometimes Karis." Sadness filled her at that thought, and the years he had lived without physical contact. "And me." She drew the sleeve of the coat and her jumper back, and raised her hand so her palm was facing his. He stared at them when she pressed them together, and his fingers slipped between hers, linking their hands. Heat engulfed her hand, but it didn't burn her, not even when small flames flickered over his skin. Relief flowed through her with the heat of his touch, and she smiled as her fears melted away, all of her tension leaving her. She had been worried that his power would somehow come between them and force them to part before they ever reached the underworld where they could be together. She hadn't wanted to lose him, and now she had no reason to fear that she would. She looked up into his eyes. They were golden and flickering, locked on hers with such intensity that she felt hot all the way to her soul, and knew without a doubt that nothing would come between them. I guess we'll just have to get me some new clothing made of the same material as yours, she whispered, and he finally smiled, the sight a balm for her aching heart as it chased the remaining storm clouds from his eyes. His phone beeped in her coat pocket, and she released his hand and pulled it out. A scowling picture of Diamond filled the bright screen. At least Ares's power wouldn't come between them. She couldn't say the same about demons and brothers. He took the phone from her, his expression one of sheer concentration, as he swiped his thumb over it to activate it. He had probably melted a lot of phones in his years. She couldn't imagine how hard he had to concentrate just to do daily tasks that took no effort for her. Using remote controls, opening windows and doors, having a shower. The list was probably endless and exhausting for him. He handed the phone back to her. It was hot. She slid it back into her coat pocket, and Ares stood. He held his hand out to her, and she slipped hers into it, still marveling at how hot his skin was now that he had his power back. New York in winter would never feel cold again, not when she had a walking heater with her. He looked as though he would pull her into his arms, and then hesitated. "It might be safer if I just hold your hands the first time we do this." His grim glance at her clothing made her quickly nod in agreement. He had heated his phone and set fire to her jumper so far. If she stepped into his embrace and let him place his arms around her, there was a chance he would do a lot more damage than that. Megan rolled her sleeves up and took hold of his hands, her skin instantly heating and sending warmth traveling up her arms. "Don't let go." He stared at her, as serious as she had ever seen him. She nodded, not wanting to consider what would happen or where she might end up if she did lose her hold on him in the split second it took for him to teleport her somewhere. She clutched his hands and took a deep breath. The world whirled into darkness and came back into focus again. A blast of ice hit the wall of the building right beside her and cracked as it spread across the bricks. Fire arced across her vision and heat caressed her skin, and Ares pulled her behind him. An unholy snarl tore through the silence, followed by a deep growl, and then the echoing crack of a gun being fired. The darkness engulfed her again, and frigid air blasted against her as they reappeared. Her vision swam but quickly came back into focus, and she looked at the hodgepodge flat rooftops stretching around her. The sound of the fight rose from below her. Ares squeezed her hands. "You stay here and stay down. Understand?" he said, and she nodded, her eyes on the fight in the street below. Diamond was giving Omori hell, and looked as though he was winning, but all he had was a gun, and she wasn't sure how much use that was against an enemy who could control both air and ice. "Go," Megan whispered, grabbed Ares around the nape of his neck, and kissed him hard. His lips were hot against hers, but he still tasted the same, and he still kissed her as though he couldn't get enough of her. He broke away and did something that made her heart stop. He didn't teleport. He ran and leaped off the edge of the building. She raced forwards and reached the edge in time to see him land squarely on his feet and launch himself into the fray, hitting Omori in the chest with a spiraling whip made of fire. Damn, she loved that man. She hunched low at the edge of the roof, hidden from view, watching the fight with her heart in her mouth. If anything happened to either him or Diamond, she was going to head down there. She wouldn't stand by on the sidelines and watch them get hurt, or worse. She would risk Ares' wrath in order to help him and his brothers. She was part of this battle now, and she wouldn't back down. She would keep fighting until it was over, and the world and Ares were safe. She would keep fighting for their future. Chapter 25. Ares pulled his arm back and slashed forwards again, causing the flaming whip to cut through the air, heading straight for Omori's back. Diamond leaped out of the way on the other side of the slim, blonde demon, rolling across the deep tarmac and then kicking off to propel himself to a safe distance. The end of the fiery whip caught Amori's leather-clad shoulder, and he disappeared. Ares wheeled around and swept his hand out at the same time as the hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and his internal demon radar screamed a warning. 5 thick shards of blue ice shot towards him, one of them penetrating the wall of fire he had created. He quickly veered right, and the icy javelin skimmed his left biceps, cutting a groove in his flesh and tearing a low growl from him. He clenched his teeth and shut down the pain, locking it out of his mind. Diamond was on Amori before Ares could react, his younger, white-haired brother driving him backwards with a flurry of punches and perfectly executed kicks. Ares had always thought Diamond took the Hong Kong thing too seriously, and now he knew he was right. His brother fought like a man who had watched thousands of hours of martial arts movies and had memorized every move. A few of them Ares wanted to know himself. His brother would have to give him some lessons after this fight was over, and maybe Megan too. He wanted to know that she could protect herself should she come up against any demons in the future, or any mortals. Hell, he just wanted to know she could protect herself. Amori swung hard at Diamond, catching him in the right temple and sending him down. Ares was on the demon in an instant, picking up where his brother had left off, giving Diamond time to regain his senses and get back on his feet. He created 2 twisting whips of fire and slashed at Amori with them in the dimly lit side street. They needed to wrap this fight up fast before the mortal authorities got wind of it. Cars stuttered in view at the far end of the street where it merged with a main road, and Ares had seen 1 or 2 mortals on foot peer down the road and then make a run for it when they spotted the brawl. Ares struck again with his flaming whips, driving them hard and fast at his enemy. Amori evaded half of the attacks and deflected the others with swift blasts of ice. Ares needed to get that power away from him. The fight was too even while the demon could control ice. He needed to tip it in his favor, and that meant getting Diamond's power back to him somehow. His eyes dropped as he struck again, focusing on Amori's hand as he raised it. The golden disk glowed blue against his palm, and ice shot out. Diamond's power had to be in that amulet. Marek would kill him if he was wrong. Fuck, Diamond would kill him, but he had to target the amulet and destroy it. He had to ensure Amori couldn't steal his power again. He just hoped that destroying it wouldn't obliterate any chance of regaining Diamond's power. One of Ares's whips struck the wall of the building where he had hidden Megan on the roof, and fire blazed up it. It petered out before it reached the roof, and he resisted looking there, not wanting to draw Amori's attention to her location. She would be safe there, hidden in the darkness. A globe of ice slammed into his right shoulder, knocking it backwards, and then another exploded against his left arm. Ice spread over his skin, encasing it from his hand to his biceps and burning as it drained his heat. He snarled and focused on his left hand, and the ice hissed and steamed. Fire broke through cracks, and the ice fell away in chunks, smashing on the ground. He was getting tired of this demon. Time to put him to bed. He ran, evading more twisting spikes of ice, barely keeping ahead of them as he headed straight for the wall at the end of the junction in the side streets. He hit it hard with his right foot and ran up at a short distance at a diagonal, diverting course towards Amori. Ice exploded in shards behind him, impacting with the bricks and shaking the building. One flew right at him. He focused, and the darkness embraced him, and he grinned as he appeared above Amori. He landed hard on the demon, tearing a pained shriek from him as he slammed him into the ground and pinned him to it. He dropped to his knees, using them to restrain Amori's arms, and slammed his right fist into his face, cracking his nose and splitting his lip. The scent of Amori's black blood grew thicker in the air, and an unholy snarl rumbled through Ares. He hated that smell. It drove him deep into his darker side, tearing down every good part of him that came from his mother and unleashing the violence he had inherited from his father. He grinned as it flowed through him, black as night, urges so dark and powerful that he could only obey them. He shifted his gaze to Amari's hand and the amulet, and fire broke out over his own hands. Destroy! A sharp, hot pain exploded in his left shoulder, sending him jerking backwards, and he roared. Amari grinned up at him, revealing bloodied teeth, his hazel eyes glowing pale blue. Ares snarled and grasped the shard of ice penetrating his left shoulder, and grimaced as he slowly pulled it out of his flesh. His body released it with a wet, sucking sound, and blood coursed down his chest, hot against his skin. "Ares!" Diamond shouted, and the next thing he knew, darkness swept over him. The world whirled back into colors again, and Ares growled and shoved his brother away, struggling to control his flames at the same time so he didn't hurt him. "I had him." "No, he had you." Diamond ignored the dark look Ares shot at him and inspected his chest and shoulder, running his gaze over him. "This is bad. You can't fight like this." Ares shot him a glare. "I can, and I must. Just back me up." Diamond stared at him, looking as though he was going to refuse, and then nodded. The ground around their feet froze, ice covering their boots and crawling up their legs. "Fucking demon!" Ares swept his right hand out and focused the heat of his fire on the ice, melting it from his legs and around them. He couldn't risk melting it from Diamond's legs, too. He still wasn't fully in control of his power again, and until he was used to wielding it, accustomed to the feel of it once more, he would probably hurt his brother by using it on him. It had been risky enough using it on Megan. A door further along the low-lit side street burst open, slamming against the brick wall and snapping both his and Diamond's attention there. Megan raced out of the building and ran straight for him, panic and fear written across her beautiful face. She had seen him injured and come down. Foolish woman. "Protect her," Ares said to his brother, and then switched all of his focus to Amari and ran at the bastard. His left arm was useless, hanging limp at his side, drenched in blood, but he wouldn't let it slow him down. He kept running at Amari, unleashing small, bright white orbs of fire in rapid succession, forcing the demon backwards. Amari countered as many as he could, but Ares could see in his dull eyes that the fight was taking its toll on him, too. Neither of them were used to their power and the drain it had on them, and both of them were injured. It was going to come down to who could push themselves the hardest, beyond the pain barrier and the fatigue that threatened to leave them vulnerable and open to attack. Megan called his name, and Diamond grumbled something at her. Ares didn't catch what she snapped back at him, but he could imagine it had been dark and vicious. Ares drew his arm back, forming a thick whip of fire, and brought it down, sending the long, spiraling funnel towards Amari. The demon countered him with a rain of small shards of ice. 3 of them caught Ares on his left arm as he tried to evade them, and he bit his tongue to stop himself from crying out. Megan would try to come to his aid if he let his pain show, and he couldn't allow that to happen. He used some of his remaining strength to step, appearing behind Amari along the other side road, drawing him away from Megan and Diamond. Amari turned on him as planned, sweeping both hands forwards, forming twin waves of ice that raced towards Ares. He ground his teeth and focused his power, calling everything he had at his disposal, and giving the darkness boiling inside him free rein, allowing it to take over. He embraced it, and the fire in his veins became an inferno. Flames erupted over his skin, chasing up his arms and over his back and his chest. He growled in pain as they cauterized the wounds on his left arm and on his chest and back, and forced both of his hands forwards, unleashing twin blazing waves of his own. They clashed with Amari's glittering ice, and steam swirled across the road, blocking his view of the demon. Had it been enough? His inside swirled in that sickening way that warned him Amari was closing in. Ares roared and shot his right hand forwards, unleashing the maximum force of his power that he could in his limited state. If it wasn't enough this time, He would risk his father's wrath and the safety of this world to unlock more. Fire erupted from his palm, a violent white tornado that tore through the steam and burned it away. Burned everything away. The bricks of the building on either side of him melted and fizzed, their mortar turning to glass under the intense heat. The tarmac bubbled and caught fire. Amori shrieked, long and loud, piercing the night. Ares' strength left him, and he collapsed to his knees, pain ricocheting through his bones and his blood on fire, burning him at 1,000 degrees. His power stuttered and died. Silence fell. The sound of footsteps shattered it. Whimpering, too. Ares was glad to note that pained, pathetic sound wasn't coming from him. He grasped his left arm and breathed hard, struggling to remain conscious. He couldn't remember the last time he had unleashed that much of his power in one shot, and he sure as hell wouldn't be doing it again. He trembled all over, body threatening to shut down and send him into dark oblivion. "Ares?" Megan's soft voice laced with concern warmed his heart, and then she was in front of him, worried eyes darting around his face and then over his body. "Keep still." He thought he might have nodded, but wasn't sure if he moved. His ears rang, the sound irritating him together with the weakness that had him shaking still. Her hand touched his shoulder, and intense warmth traveled outwards from the point where her palm pressed against his cauterized wound. He wanted to tell her to stop, but he didn't have the strength to speak. Something shifted behind her, fuzzy in his vision, and he panicked. He grabbed her arm and pulled her against him, and she murmured soft, reassuring words. His eyes cleared as her healing power worked its magic on him, and he saw it was Diamond in the road behind her. He had Amori pinned beneath him, his knee against the demon's throat and his hands glittering with ice. Ares was glad that his brother somehow had his power back, but he wasn't pleased about one thing. The look on Diamond's face spoke of violence and death. He couldn't allow that to happen. He wanted Amori dead for what he had done, but he couldn't go against Karis's orders. They needed to question the demon. He grasped Megan's shoulder and pulled himself onto his feet, swaying violently the whole time. She clutched his arm, and he thanked her with a tight smile, not only for helping him, but for not trying to stop him. "Diamond." Ares pushed the word out, and his brother looked across at him, the darkness in his expression not lifting. "Don't." Megan helped him walk to his brother and the demon, and he frowned as the other side of Amori came into view. His entire arm was charred and smoldering, the amulet a melted pool of gold against blackened flesh. Amori twitched, eyes wild with fear and pain. Diamond's expression remained blacker than midnight, and Ares could see he was itching to rain icy hell down on the demon. "Back off," Ares said, and Diamond stared at him, his eyes transforming from pale blue to purest white, a warning that he was close to losing control. "Diamond?" He wasn't going to ask again. Diamond remained still for a few long seconds more, and then removed his knee from the demon's neck and slowly stood. He grabbed Amori around the throat, causing fingers of ice to chase around the back of it, joining there, and hauled him onto his knees. Ares closed his eyes and focused, shutting down the pain in his left arm. Megan's hand covered his right one, and he opened his eyes and stared at their joined hands. He squeezed her fingers, trying to reassure her. "I'll be fine. Wait here," he said, and she nodded, understanding in her dark eyes. He didn't want her anywhere near Amori while they were questioning him. Diamond shifted behind Amori, his hand against the back of his neck. A collar of ice restrained the whimpering demon, and smoke curled from his burnt left side. His arm hung limp, and Ares felt no sympathy for him. He had brought this upon himself by targeting Megan, and by targeting the gate and the underworld. It had been kill or be killed, a battle of life and death, the sort that Ares had missed. It had felt good to fight beside his brother again, to battle a worthy foe, but Ares had the terrible feeling that their fight wasn't over. "My arm," Amaury muttered, his French accent thick. His head drooped, and Diamond yanked on his neck, forcing him to remain awake. Ares halted in front of the demon and stared down at him.
"Why were you after Megan?"
Amaury's dull eyes rolled backwards and then opened again. They fixed on Ares, and he smiled, his teeth covered in black blood. "I wanted her power."
"Why?"
Ares growled down at him. Amaury continued to smile. Ares's instincts flared, issuing a warning that something was wrong. Amaury was facing death in the form of two very angry gods of the underworld, but he looked unafraid. There wasn't a trace of fear in his eyes now. "I just wanted it." He looked around, gaze scanning over the side street, and then Ares. He settled it on him and stared, and Ares frowned at him and the feeling that he was waiting for something. Ares grabbed his shoulders, squeezed them hard, and shook him. The ice around his neck fractured and healed, spreading over his collarbones. Amaury winced. "Explain yourself. Tell me why you wanted Megan's power, and I will make your death a swift one." Ares shook him again, and his expression didn't shift. It remained placid and calm, not a single sliver of fear crossing it. Had he accepted that he would die, and that was why he wasn't afraid anymore? "Answer my brother," Diamond said, and the ice spread to Amaury's shoulders, encasing them in sharp, thick claws. Amaury snarled and tried to move, but Diamond held him. The demon tipped his head back. "What are you waiting for?" Ares frowned. "You want to die?" "No." Amaury's hazel eyes widened, wild with fear all of a sudden. They darted around the quiet street and then up again. "No. This is their fault, not mine." Ares exchanged a confused glance with Diamond. Amaury glared and spat black blood at him. "This is your fault. You shouldn't have been there. I could have taken her, drink of her blood, and eat of her flesh. It's the only way to heal any wound instantly." Ares growled, his patience snapping with the thought of this demon killing Megan and desecrating her body like that. He slammed a fiery punch into Amaury's jaw, knocking him to his right and out of Diamond's grip. He hit the floor, and the ice around his shoulders and neck shattered. Amaury instantly pushed himself up with his right arm, but Diamond was on him before he could make a move to escape, grabbing the back of his leather jacket and pulling him back onto his knees in front of Ares. "You will never touch her," Ares snarled, and drew his fist back again, hunger to strike the demon and kill him, driving him to the edge. "Megan belongs to me now. She is mine to protect, and you will die for trying to harm her." Amaury's wild eyes widened further, and he shook his head, his gaze leaping around between Ares, Megan, and the buildings surrounding them. He flung his head back. "Do not abandon me." Ares grasped Amaury's throat and shook him again, making sure he had his attention, because he needed him to answer this next question. "Are you part of the uprising?" Amaury stilled. His eyes drifted down to meet Ares's, and he stared at him, calm again, a sense of resignation rolling off him. He lunged at Ares, his words a black snarl. "You forced their hand." Amaury halted as if suddenly frozen, and then his head snapped back. His eyes locked on the dark sky, and his irises glowed bright purple. Diamond leaped back at the same time as Ares, moving to a safe distance. Dark purple and black smoke bled out of Amaury's chest and his open mouth and eyes, and he withered before Ares's eyes, his skin crumpling as it blackened. This was not good. There was only one reason a demon's soul would suddenly exit his body, and that was if it was being drawn out of him, and there was only one demon species in this world with a penchant for sucking on souls. One Ares did not want to tangle with. "Guys," Megan said, and Aries shot a glance over his shoulder to her, heart slamming against his chest. It eased when he saw she was fine, but started drumming harder again when her eyes remained locked on the sky. He looked in the direction of her gaze. The smoke rising from Amori curled upwards and then across, heading into the darkness, towards a silhouette of a man with a pair of glowing purple eyes. "Wraith," Aries snarled, and Diamond growled with him, muttering dark words under his breath. The man's bright violet eyes shifted to Aries, and then he disappeared. Amori crumbled into dust. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. Chapter 26. Darkness embraced Aries, swirling around him, a cold but comforting touch that soothed him as it briefly connected him to the underworld. The connection severed, and the mortal world appeared again, the pale coffee-colored walls of his apartment comforting him more than the link to his world had, easing his fatigue and instilling a sense of calm in him. Megan would be safer here, but not safe enough to satisfy him. His entire body ached, pain throbbing through his bones, and his left shoulder and arm hurt. He had taken a severe beating tonight and had come close to losing the fight, and Megan wasn't even safe. Amori hadn't intended to take her power using his ability. He had intended to use her blood and her flesh to grant him and others the power to instantly regenerate, and that meant that Megan was still in danger, even though the demon was dead. Killed by another demon to protect whoever else was behind what was happening. Aries had left Karis and the others in Tokyo when Megan had fallen asleep on the couch in the television area of the ancient mansion. Diamond had offered to catch him up on the discussion about Amori and the Wraith, and what they all agreed was about to hit their lives, and none of his brothers had protested about him leaving. He was grateful for that, but he knew it would be a long time before they accepted her into the close-knit circle he was part of with them. Escher alone would stop it from happening, and Aries would never pain his younger brother by forcing Megan upon the group or pressing for her to be allowed to participate in meetings. He had only brought her tonight because they had come straight from the fight with Amori, neither he nor Diamond willing to waste a second when they both felt as though a clock was ticking, counting down to the next attack. Many of his brothers probably felt that he should have stayed, but Megan needed her rest. He wasn't sure whether she had recovered from healing both him and his brother yet. She murmured in his arms, her head nestled against his right shoulder, her soft breath skating over his neck. She still wore his coat, buttoned down her front now to keep her warm while she slept, and protected from his fire. His left arm had protested from the moment he had risked picking her up, but the incredible sight of her in his embrace, unharmed by his fire, had driven the pain to the back of his mind. It was strange to see her there when he could feel his power racing through his veins, shimmering close to his skin. It wasn't just her power that protected her from his fire. It was his willpower and his desire to control his flames around her, too. It was his love for her and his need to keep her safe and unharmed. Whenever she was touching him, his power felt as it had back in the underworld, a part of him, but not one that manifested itself. He had to concentrate at times, but he had a feeling that it wouldn't always be that way around her, and that he would learn to instinctively control it so she would always be safe. Megan murmured, and her eyes slowly opened, their rich brown depths soft with sleep. She blinked, a frown crinkled her brow, and then she looked around them at the apartment. Her gaze sought his. "We're home." Aries liked that. It drew a smile to his lips. "Home?" he said, unable to stop himself from questioning her choice of words when he wanted to hear her say that she had called it that on purpose. She smiled sheepishly. "I have this impression that you're not going to let me out of your sight, so I figured I might as well get used to calling this my home." "I like the sound of that." He set her down on her feet, and she stretched. She was right. I'm never going to leave you alone again. I want you by my side, where I can see you and know you're safe. Megan pressed her hands to his stomach, tiptoed, and rewarded him with a slow kiss that threatened to crank his temperature up. He couldn't believe that he could still do this with her. He savored each sweep of her lips over his and puff of air that caressed them. The throbbing in his bones subsided, replaced by a different sort of ache, one that made warmth curl through him and had his thoughts diving down a route that probably wasn't the wisest one he could take right now. She was tired, and he still hadn't fully regained control of his fire. Making love with her would have to wait. She caught hold of his hands, broke away from him, and started walking backwards, luring him towards the bedroom. I'm sleepy, she said, but something in her eyes told him that sleep was the last thing on her mind. I've been fighting. He looked himself over, drawing her attention to the tears in his clothes and the still healing flesh beneath them. I stink. She wrinkled her nose. You don't smell. You say that now while I'm dressed. Believe me, I reek and I'm covered in blood. I'll take a shower while you get some rest. She didn't look as though she was going to go along with that. In fact, she looked as though she had seen straight through his chivalry to his fear and was plotting his downfall. Her gaze slid to the bathroom on her right. She dropped his left hand and tightened her grip on his right and diverted towards the bathroom. What are you doing? He said, his voice tight and nerves getting the better of him. He wanted to kiss her and touch her, wanted to do everything the invite in her eyes had asked of him, but he wasn't sure if he would hurt her if things turned passionate between them. I'm going to finish what we started that day when you first kissed me. He frowned at the back of her head, part of him saying to go for it, and the rest telling him it was a bad idea. It might be dangerous now. I don't know if I can fully control my power yet. She smiled over her shoulder, her dark eyes bright with mischief and desire, as her shoulder-length dark hair fell away to reveal her face. What better place to do a test run, then? You're hardly going to burn me in the shower. He grinned. He loved the way his woman thought. She paused in the middle of the bathroom, and he leaned against the doorframe as she stripped off, tossing his long black coat on the floor. Her dark jumper and T-shirt followed, and then her trainers and jeans, until she stood before him in only crimson underwear. He gave up the fight, just as he always would when it came to her. He would always end up doing whatever she wanted, because he wanted her to be happy. And he could put a damn big smile on her face. He grabbed the hem of his ruined black T-shirt with his right hand and winced as he tried to pull it over his head. She crossed the room to him and helped him remove it, bringing it over his head and right arm first, and then carefully down his left. She frowned and smoothed her fingers over his left arm and pectoral. The skin had healed, but the flesh beneath was tender and ached as she gently pressed with her fingertips. "You're sure you're up to this?" she whispered, and glanced up into his eyes. "It was your idea," he countered, and she blushed, cheeks flushing dark pink and making him want to kiss her. So he did. He lowered his head and captured her lips with his, kissing her slowly and building the heat between them as she worked on his jeans. His hard length throbbed as she brushed it, and then she pushed his jeans and underwear down to his feet. He focused, concentrating on subduing his fire so he wouldn't hurt her, and kicked his boots off, followed by his jeans and underwear. Megan unhooked her bra, and he groaned at the sight of her firm breasts tipped with dark pink buds that cried out for him to wrap his lips around them and suck until she moaned his name in that breathy way that always made him want to moan too. She pushed her red panties down and stepped out of them, and then slid the door of the double-width shower cubicle open. He followed her into it and twisted the knob to get the water flowing, fearing that if he didn't douse himself soon, he would combust from just looking at her. She stepped under the jet of warm water and tipped her head back, letting it cascade over her dark hair. She slicked it back, away from her face, and opened her eyes and brought them down to him. Her pupils swallowed the color in her irises, speaking to him of passion and hungers that he ached to satisfy. When she reached out and curled her fingers around his cock, he groaned and shuddered and couldn't stop himself from moving. He closed the distance between them, the water bouncing off her shoulders and spraying over his chest. She slid her hand down his hard length and then turned away from him and grabbed the shower gel. "So I'll wash you like I would have then, and we'll go to bed, right?" she said. He stared at her, a low growl issuing from his throat that surprised him. There was no way he was going to let her idea about finishing what they started in the shower that day be so chaste and sweet. He had come into this shower on the proviso that they would get naked and things would get wicked, and that was exactly the way they were going to go. He pulled the bottle of gel from her grip, and she reached for it. He held it above his head, and she glared at him and settled her hands on her hips, drawing his gaze down the length of her body. Water ran over her smooth skin, and his hands itched to mimic it and travel wherever it had touched. He didn't realize that her distraction had caused him to relax, and in turn made him lower his hand to within her reach, until she had grabbed the shower gel from him. "Wash first, play later." She squeezed a dollop of soap onto her hand and set to work, and it was maddening. The feel of her soapy hands slipping across his body, tracing every ridge of his muscles, lingering in places, drove him crazy with need. He stared down at her, struggling to stop himself from grabbing her and taking her right that second. She knew she was torturing him. It was right there shining in her eyes as they tracked her hands, together with what looked like sheer delight. "You're enjoying this," he muttered, meaning torturing him. She flicked a glance up at his face and smiled. "You're the first man I've known in this world who has the body of a god and is a god. Let me enjoy it. I could spend hours just touching you like this." That was it. There was no way he could take hours of her tracing her fingers over his flesh. "Wash time is over. Playtime begins now." He grabbed her around the waist and pulled her against his soapy chest. She opened her mouth to protest, but he swooped on it and kissed her. Her words came out as a throaty moan, and she dropped the bottle. It clattered around his feet, and he backed her under the water, letting it rain down on them. His left shoulder burned, but he ignored it and skimmed his hand down her side. He pressed her against the tiles beneath the jet and dipped his hand lower, sliding over her wet stomach and down to the apex of her thighs. She clutched his upper arms and moaned into his mouth again, tiptoeing and pushing herself up the tiles, inviting him closer. He slipped his fingers into her plush petals, found her aroused nub, and groaned as his cock pulsed against her side. She wriggled against it, rubbing him, driving him further out of his mind. Heat blazed through him, and he struggled to keep his focus, afraid that it wasn't the usual burn of passion in his veins. Gods, he wanted to be inside her. He moved his hand lower, and she dipped, spreading her knees so he could touch her. She craned her neck and kept kissing him, more frantic now, desperate sweeps of her mouth over his that conveyed her need. It echoed within him, pushing him to surrender control and give himself over to his passion. Her hands moved to his shoulders, and she pulled herself up. His right hand went to her backside, raising her up his body, and he groaned when she settled her legs around his waist, trapping his left hand and his hard, aching length between them. She moaned and tipped her head back, her eyes closed, and a look of sheer pleasure crossing her face. He circled her arousal and then dipped his hand down and groaned as he eased 2 fingers inside her hot sheath. His cock pulsed, aching with the need to replace his fingers. He could do this. He was touching her without hurting her, and his fire was under control. He could take things further. "Aries," she husked, her throaty plea enticing him to push away his fears. She tangled her fingers in his wet hair, twisting the strands around their slender lengths, and tugged his mouth back to her. Her tongue thrust past his lips and teeth, and he slanted his head and joined her, fighting her for dominance. She rocked against his hand, and he shuddered, unable to take any more. He pulled his fingers out of her, grabbed her backside with his right hand and his erection with his left, and slowly eased into her. She still felt hot, burning him as he inched inside, sending him out of his mind as pleasure ripped through him. She moaned against his lips and pushed down on him, forcing him into her welcoming heat and sending him over the brink. Ares grabbed her bottom with both hands, pinned her against the tiles, and kissed her hard as he pumped into her, long, deep strokes that threatened to have him coming undone before long, and had her moaning with each meeting of their bodies. She worked her hips against his, her feet pressing into his backside as he flexed against her, curling his hips to drive himself deep into her core. "Ares," she moaned between kisses, the sound of his name whispered so breathily and sweetly, sending a bolt of pure pleasure through him. He closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against hers, and focused on the feel of her around him, against him, until she became his whole world. The sound of their rough breathing drowned out the rush of water against his back. Her breathy moans of bliss tore through him, heightening his own pleasure, driving him to bring her over the brink with him. He pumped into her, withdrawing as far as he could, before sliding back in and burying himself to the hilt. She clenched and teased him, dug her nails into his back, and clung to him. He drew back and stared deep into her eyes, saw all her love and affection in them, and knew she would see the same feelings reflected in his. His heart swelled, his pleasure intensifying, overwhelming him as he absorbed those feelings, took them, and locked them deep in his soul. She was his now, forever. She arched forwards and cried out his name, her body quivering around his. He thrust harder into her, focusing on the ecstasy on her face and the feel of her throbbing around him, and grunted as he found release, pulsing and spilling himself inside her. He rested his head in the crook of her neck, and she held him there, stroking his shoulder and his hair as water rained down on them. "Loved that," she murmured huskily with a smile in her voice, and pressed a kiss to his temple. "Love you." Ares found the strength to pull back again and looked deep into her eyes. "Love you too." He kissed her again, and she wrapped her arms and legs around him, holding him against her in a way that said she would never let him go. He was hers now, forever. Ares eased his hips back and withdrew from her, and set her down in the shower. She pouted at him and then smiled again. "No fiery problems?" she said, and he shook his head, only just realizing that he had made love to her and not once had his power pushed for control or hurt her. He grinned. At least some things in his life were looking good. He picked up the shower gel, squeezed some onto his palm, and rubbed them together, forming lather. He stepped towards Megan, and she frowned at his hands. "You're not getting your own back." She held her hands up, but it didn't stop him. He pressed his soapy palms to her breasts, and she moaned, cursing him softly. It was only fair. She had driven him crazy by washing him, and she needed cleaning too. He skimmed his hands over her, taking his time, enjoying the slippery feel of her beneath his palms. When he reached the apex of her thighs, she huffed and gently pushed him away, chastising him with a glare that didn't last. Her smile broke through again. She turned off the shower and he stepped out, giving her room to exit the cubicle too. She picked up a towel and looked as though she was going to dry him off, so he took it from her and concentrated to keep his mood calm. She frowned. "Towels and me have a rocky relationship," he said, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "Does that mean you won't be drying me?" Ares groaned, and his control slipped. The water on his hands evaporated, and her eyes shot to them. He focused and reined his fire back, tamping it down and forcing himself to relax. "I can do that." He stepped towards her and focused on her beautiful body as he dried her from head to toe, paying close attention to her breasts and her shapely legs. He reached her feet and paused to press a kiss to her stomach. She giggled and ran her fingers over his hair, down the curve of his ear and under his jaw. He rose to his feet before her, obeying her silent command, wrapped the towel around her, tucking it closed between her breasts, and then kissed her. His fire faded, a gentle burn in his blood, placid and under control. It still astounded him whenever it did that. Megan deepened the kiss, threatening to test the limits of his ability to control his power around her. He pulled away, and her smile was beautiful. "Slow it is. I like it when we go slow." There was mischief in her eyes again, and he loved it. This woman would never stop tying him in knots or bringing him to his knees with just a look. He was a fool for her. Gods, he was just like his father after all, willing to do anything for the woman he loved, weak for her and only her. She breezed past him, and he grabbed one of the towels, dried himself off, and then wrapped it around his waist. He followed her out of the bathroom. She wasn't in the living room. Cold air flowed over his bare chest. He looked to his left, towards the bedroom, and found Megan on the balcony, wearing his navy robe. He patted across the wooden floor to her and stepped out onto the balcony behind her. She glanced over her shoulder at him, the wet ribbons of her hair obscuring part of her face, but not hiding her tender smile. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her back against his front, savoring the feel of her there, safe in his embrace, with him. He rested his chin on top of her head and stared out at the dark city stretching before him. It flickered between this world and the other world. The buildings were no longer rubble, but they were still ruins, parts of them destroyed and smoking in the fiery darkness. The trees in the park burned brightly, the flames reaching high into the air. Screams of mortal suffering and shrieks filled the air, and the coppery stench of demon was strong, choking him. Amori was dead, but Ares' city still burned, the destruction only slightly reversed, and not for long. A building crumbled in the distance, black smoke billowing upwards and along the streets, blotting out the fires and smothering the screams. War was on the horizon. The enemy had made its first move, and it wouldn't be long before they made their next one. Ares pulled Megan closer to him and looked down at her, seeing her in this world, safe in his embrace. No matter what happened, he would always protect her. He held her to him, needing to feel her in his arms. He would never give this up. Cars rushed by below them, and the cold night air carried the scent of rain again. Warm lights dotted the perfect skyscrapers and snaked through the dark swath of the park. He would fight to protect his gate and those of his brothers, not only to protect the underworld, not anymore. He would fight to protect Megan's world, because she had become his world now, and his place was beside her in this one. He would fight for her. He stared out at the city, and it flickered to the future, and another building collapsed and burned bright in the red darkness. Megan turned in his arms, pressed her palms to his chest, and kissed him, and he knew he wasn't alone in his feelings. They would fight for their world. They would fight against the growing darkness together, side by side, with the aid of his brothers. They would fight for their forever, and that fight started now. This has been Ares, Guardians of Hades romance series, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Kevin Foley. Copyright 2016-2017 by Felicity Heaton. Production copyright 2017 by Felicity Heaton.